It began, or perhaps it had always been, with dreams that felt too big for one small boy to carry. Not frightening dreams, not the kind that jolt you awake, heart racing, eyes darting to the shadows. These were softer, slower, like falling into a warm tide you didn't quite understand. In them, Morty saw himself walking down countless roads, each one leading somewhere different, each him a little older, a little changed. Some smiled, some frowned, some walked alone, and some walked with Rick at their side, and sometimes in the quietest parts of the dream he caught glimpses of a boy who wasn't him at all, yet somehow felt the same. Before we go any further, I want you to know something. We truly love you. And I mean that in the simplest, clearest way. No strings, no conditions. Just, we're glad you're here. Wherever you are in the world, whatever your day has been like, this is your time to slow down. So, before we begin the story, tell me, where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it there? Now grab your coffee, or maybe your tea, or your favourite blanket. Let's get started. The dreams began on quiet nights, when the world seemed to hum in the background. He'd wake to find his pillow faintly warm, as if someone had been sitting beside him, and on more than one morning there would be something there. Not toys, not notes, not anything he could name. Once it was a star-shaped light, small enough to fit in his palm, glowing so gently he thought it might vanish if he breathed too hard. Another time it was a scent, the smell of rain on dust, though the window was shut and the sky outside was still. Morty never told his parents, partly because he wasn't sure they'd believe him, and partly because the dreams felt private, in a way he didn't want to disturb. It was his secret, though not in the way kids hide candy or report cards. It was more like hiding a tiny bird in your hands, knowing that if you showed it to someone too soon, it might fly away forever. When he was younger, before Rick came back into their lives, Morty's world was small. School, home, the flicker of TV in the evenings. Occasionally the sound of his parents arguing in the kitchen, voices rising and falling like they were trying to win a game only they knew the rules to. Morty learned to tune it out, to let the noise become just another hum in the background, like a fridge or a distant highway. The first time Rick showed up, Morty didn't know if it was for him or for his mom, or maybe for no one at all. Rick had a way of arriving like he'd been there all along, like time was a thing he could step in and out of whenever he pleased. Morty remembered the way the old man's eyes flicked over him, quick, calculating, but not unkind. And then Rick had smiled. Not a big smile, not the kind you take pictures of. Just a small curve at the corner of his mouth, as if he'd seen something in Morty worth keeping, an eye on. It was weeks before Rick invited him anywhere. Even then, it wasn't with fanfare. "Come on," he'd said, like they were just going to the corner store. But instead of streets and traffic lights, there was a door, or something like a door, shimmering and green, pulsing gently like it was breathing. Morty had hesitated. Rick hadn't. Later, Morty would realize that hesitation was one of the things Rick had always counted on. He needed Morty to be cautious, to notice things Rick sometimes ignored. But in that moment, Morty didn't know any of that. He just knew his grandfather had opened a way to somewhere else, and that stepping through felt like falling into one of his dreams. Except this time, he was awake. The first world they landed in wasn't dangerous. It wasn't full of monsters or traps or any of the chaos Morty would later come to expect. It was just quiet. A sky the colour of slow-moving honey, a breeze that smelled faintly of cinnamon. There were no people, no animals, just tall grass that bent as if bowing to them. Rick didn't speak for a long time, and Morty didn't ask. When they finally left, Rick didn't explain where they'd been or why, but that night Morty dreamed of a boy standing in that same golden field. And when he woke, the star-shaped light was back on his pillow. Over the next months, the trips became more frequent. Some were loud and strange, filled with sights that made Morty's head spin. Others were still and slow, like slipping into the spaces between thoughts. Rick never said what decided their destination. Sometimes Morty wondered if Rick knew at all, or if he simply followed some internal compass no one else could read. Through it all, Morty began to notice something. The more time they spent together, the more the dreams changed. The roads he saw in them grew longer, winding further into places he couldn't name. The other versions of himself seemed clearer now, their faces sharper, their movements more deliberate, and somewhere, always somewhere, Rick was there. Not always the same Rick. Sometimes he was older, sometimes younger, sometimes dressed in strange clothes. But it was always him. Always that same look, a mixture of knowing everything and still wondering if any of it mattered. One evening, after a trip to a world made entirely of glass bridges that rang like bells underfoot, Morty asked Rick a question. "Do you ever dream?" Rick paused mid-step, portal gun in hand. "Not the way you do, kid." And then he stepped through, leaving the question floating in the air like dust in a beam of light. That night, Morty dreamed of a Rick who was sleeping. He'd never seen that before. The man's face was peaceful, almost soft, as though the weight he carried had been set down just for a moment. Morty didn't know what it meant, but he felt lighter when he woke, and for the first time, he wondered if maybe his dreams weren't just his own. It didn't happen the way Morty imagined. There was no dramatic knock on his bedroom door, no grand announcement that today was the day he'd take his first real walk with Rick. Instead, it began in the middle of the afternoon, sunlight falling in long stripes across the living room carpet, and Rick standing by the kitchen counter, tinkering with something that looked like a cross between a flashlight and a harmonica. "Grab your shoes," Rick said, not looking up. Morty hesitated. "Where are we going?" Rick shrugged, that loose, dismissive movement that somehow made everything feel both casual and inevitable. "Out," and that was that. Morty pulled on his sneakers, wondering if this was one of those moments where he should ask more questions, or if asking would only make Rick change his mind. He decided to keep quiet. The walk didn't start with a portal. It started with an actual walk, the kind that put one foot in front of the other along an ordinary suburban street. Rick's lab coat fluttered slightly in the breeze, and Morty kept glancing up at him, waiting for the big reveal. But Rick didn't speak. He just walked, eyes forward, hands deep in his pockets. Morty was used to walks with his mom or dad, where conversation filled the gaps. Questions about school, comments on the weather, little stories to pass the time. This was different. Rick didn't seem interested in filling the silence, and after a while, Morty began to realize the silence itself was the point. They turned down streets Morty had never taken before, past houses he'd never noticed, until the neighborhood began to thin and the air smelled faintly of metal and rain. At the edge of a small empty park, Rick stopped. From his pocket, he pulled a small device no bigger than a key fob and pressed it. The air in front of them shivered, not violently, more like the ripples that move across water when you drop a single pebble. A doorway appeared, its edges soft and glowing, the color of deep green glass. Rick stepped through without looking back. Morty swallowed, then followed. The first thing he noticed on the other side was the sound, not loud but layered, a mix of wind, distant chimes, and something almost like laughter, though it came from nowhere and everywhere at once. They were standing on a narrow path that wound through fields of tall, pale grass swaying in slow motion. Above them, the sky shifted in subtle gradients, as if it couldn't decide on one color, and kept trying them all. Morty glanced at Rick, who was already walking again. This time, Morty didn't ask questions. They walked for what felt like hours, though time here didn't seem to matter. The air was warm without being heavy, and Morty found his shoulders relaxing in a way they didn't at home. He watched the way Rick's eyes kept drifting to the horizon, as though scanning for something just out of reach. Every so often, Rick's mouth would twitch like he was about to speak, but then he'd stay silent. Eventually, they reached a rise in the path, and Morty saw it, a stretch of land dotted with low, glimmering shapes. At first he thought they were stones, but as they got closer, he realized they were eggs. Dozens of them, each the size of a watermelon, each faintly pulsing with inner light. Rick didn't touch them, didn't explain. He just slowed his pace, and Morty matched him. "Are they alive?" Morty asked quietly. Rick's gaze stayed on the path. "Everything's alive somewhere, kid." It wasn't the kind of answer Morty could unpack right away, so he didn't try. They passed the glowing eggs and kept going until the path opened into a small clearing. Here the grass gave way to smooth, dark stones, and at the center was a pool of water so still it looked like glass. Rick knelt beside it, reaching into his coat for a small vial. He uncorked it and poured a single drop into the pool. The water shimmered, then stilled again. Morty crouched beside him. What was that? Something I owed, Rick said simply. His reflection wavered in the pool, and for a second, Morty thought he saw someone else's face in the water. Not Rick's, but older somehow, more tired. When he blinked, it was gone. They stayed there a while, neither of them speaking. Morty found himself watching the way the light moved across the stones, how the air seemed to hum gently in his ears. It felt like a place that didn't need people, a place that had existed long before and would exist long after. When Rick finally stood, Morty followed. They retraced their steps along the winding path, past the eggs, through the swaying grass, and back to where the green doorway waited. Just before stepping through, Morty glanced back. The horizon was fading into a soft, silvery dusk, the kind that makes you wonder if you've been gone for years or minutes. On the walk home, they didn't talk, but Morty noticed something in Rick's face. Not quite a smile, not quite a frown, just a look that said you were supposed to see that. Later that night, Morty dreamed of the pool again. Only this time, he was the one holding the vial. And somewhere in the dream, he thought he heard Rick's voice, not speaking words, just humming a tune that seemed older than either of them. When Morty woke, his pillow was warm, and on it lay a single, tiny stone, dark and smooth, as if it had been waiting for him. The next time Rick invited Morty along, there was no preamble, just a sharp whistle from the garage, and the faint smell of solder in the air. Morty slipped on his shoes without a word, still clutching the smooth black stone from their last trip. He kept it in his pocket now, touching it without thinking, as though it was proof that the other world had been real. Rick was already by the workbench, portal gun in hand. Without looking up, he said, "Ever seen a place with more than one sun?" Morty blinked. "Like Tatooine?" Rick gave him a sideways glance. "Sure, kid, like Tatooine, except real and better." And with that, the portal bloomed open, a swirl of green that seemed to breathe in and out. Morty stepped through after Rick, the now familiar weightless sensation rushing over him. When his feet touched ground, he looked up and forgot to breathe. Above them, the sky was a shifting mosaic of suns, some small and pale, others wide and burning, each moving slowly across in its own arc. The colours bled into each other, warm golds sliding into soft pinks, deep reds fading into violet. It wasn't chaotic, it was deliberate, like an enormous painting that never stopped changing. Rick stood beside him, hands in his pockets, watching his reaction. Morty didn't notice at first, but when he did, he realized Rick wasn't looking at the sky at all. He was looking at Morty. "What do you think?" Rick asked finally. Morty searched for words. "It's different." Rick smirked faintly. "Everything's different somewhere." They began to walk. The ground here was a deep, soft blue, like moss that had been growing for centuries. It gave slightly under their steps, muffling their footsteps until the only sound was the distant hum of the suns moving overhead. At first, Morty kept craning his neck to look up, trying to follow each sun's path. But eventually, the constant shifting became too much to track, and he just let them move as they pleased. It was strangely calming, realizing you didn't have to keep count. As they walked, they passed pools of water that mirrored the sky. Looking into them made Morty dizzy. The reflection felt like another world entirely, one where the suns might be watching him instead. They stopped at a ridge overlooking a valley where the light from the suns pooled in soft gradients, making the air itself seem layered. Rick sat down on a smooth, flat stone and motioned for Morty to do the same. "You ever think about how small you are?" Rick asked, voice casual. Morty frowned. Sometimes?" Rick gestured toward the sky. All those suns. Every single one has its own orbit, its own rules. Some of them are dying. Some were born 5 minutes ago. And here we are, sitting on a rock, pretending any of it cares. Morty wasn't sure if it was meant to be comforting or not. But somehow, in Rick's voice, it didn't sound bleak. It sounded freeing. They sat there for a long while. Rick pulled something small from his coat, a silver canteen, and took a sip before passing it to Morty. The liquid inside tasted faintly sweet, like a fruit he couldn't name. It left a warmth in his chest that lingered even after he handed it back. Below them, in the valley, the light shifted again, turning the ground gold. Morty found himself thinking of the black stone in his pocket and how it felt like part of a set he didn't know he was collecting. "Do you come here a lot?" Morty asked quietly. Rick's eyes flicked toward the horizon. "Not really. The sun's changed too much. Makes it hard to get work done." Morty almost laughed, but Rick's tone wasn't entirely joking. It occurred to him that Rick had places for work and places for something else, something quieter, maybe even softer, and this was one of those places. When they finally stood, Rick didn't open the portal right away. Instead, he led Morty down into the valley, where the gold light was thickest. The air here was warmer, and tiny motes of dust floated like slow snow. In the center of the valley was a low pedestal, carved from the same deep blue moss-covered stone as the ground. On it sat an object Morty couldn't identify. Not a machine, not a rock, not anything familiar. It was a smooth oval, translucent, with faint light swirling inside like smoke. Rick reached out and touched it gently, almost reverently. The light inside brightened for a moment, then dimmed. Morty waited for an explanation, but none came. When they left, Morty kept glancing back at the valley until the ridge blocked it from view. He wondered if the object would still be there tomorrow, or if the shifting suns would erase it. Back in their own world, the late afternoon light felt almost dull after what he'd seen. Morty lingered in the garage as Rick returned to his workbench, scribbling notes in a language Morty couldn't read. Before leaving, Morty asked, "What was that thing in the valley?" Rick didn't look up. "Doesn't matter, kid. Just something that remembers." Morty didn't understand, but he felt the words settle somewhere deep, like a pebble dropped into still water. That night, the dream came again. This time, Morty was standing in the valley alone, the sky full of shifting suns. The oval object on the pedestal glowed brighter than before, and when he touched it, he heard a voice, his own, but older, speaking words he couldn't remember upon waking. When he opened his eyes, the black stone was still in his pocket, and next to it somehow was a second one, pale and warm as though it had been sitting in sunlight. The next time Rick invited Morty along, there was no preamble. Just a sharp whistle from the garage and the faint smell of solder in the air. Morty slipped on his shoes without a word, still clutching the smooth black stone from their last trip. He kept it in his pocket now, touching it without thinking, as though it was proof that the other world had been real. Rick was already by the workbench, portal gun in hand. Without looking up, he said, "Ever seen a place with more than one sun?" Morty blinked. "Like Tatooine?" Rick gave him a sideways glance. "Sure, kid. Like Tatooine. Except real and better." And with that, the portal bloomed open, a swirl of green that seemed to breathe in and out. Morty stepped through after Rick, the now familiar weightless sensation rushing over him. When his feet touched ground, he looked up and forgot to breathe. Above them, the sky was a shifting mosaic of suns, some small and pale, others wide and burning, each moving slowly across in its own arc. The colours bled into each other, warm golds sliding into soft pinks, deep reds fading into violet. It wasn't chaotic. It was deliberate, like an enormous painting that never stopped changing. Rick stood beside him, hands in his pockets, watching his reaction. Morty didn't notice at first, but when he did, he realized Rick wasn't looking at the sky at all. He was looking at Morty. "What do you think?" Rick asked finally. Morty searched for words. "It's different," Rick smirked faintly. "Everything's different somewhere." They began to walk. The ground here was a deep, soft blue, like moss that had been growing for centuries. It gave slightly under their steps, muffling their footsteps, until the only sound was the distant hum of the suns moving overhead. At first, Morty kept craning his neck to look up, trying to follow each sun's path, but eventually the constant shifting became too much to track, and he just let them move as they pleased. It was strangely calming, realizing you didn't have to keep count. As they walked, they passed pools of water that mirrored the sky. Looking into them made Morty dizzy. The reflection felt like another world entirely, one where the suns might be watching him instead. They stopped at a ridge overlooking a valley where the light from the suns pooled in soft gradients, making the air itself seem layered. Rick sat down on a smooth, flat stone and motioned for Morty to do the same. "You ever think about how small you are?" Rick asked, voice casual. Morty frowned. Sometimes?" Rick gestured toward the sky. "All those suns. Every single one has its own orbit, its own rules. Some of them are dying. Some were born 5 minutes ago. And here we are, sitting on a rock, pretending any of it cares." Morty wasn't sure if it was meant to be comforting or not, but somehow, in Rick's voice, it didn't sound bleak. It sounded freeing. They sat there for a long while. Rick pulled something small from his coat, a silver canteen, and took a sip before passing it to Morty. The liquid inside tasted faintly sweet, like a fruit he couldn't name. It left a warmth in his chest that lingered even after he handed it back. Below them, in the valley, the light shifted again, turning the ground gold. Morty found himself thinking of the black stone in his pocket and how it felt like part of a set he didn't know he was collecting. "Do you come here a lot?" Morty asked quietly. Rick's eyes flicked toward the horizon. "Not really. The sun's changed too much, makes it hard to get work done." Morty almost laughed, but Rick's tone wasn't entirely joking. It occurred to him that Rick had places for work and places for something else. Something quieter, maybe even softer. And this was one of those places. When they finally stood, Rick didn't open the portal right away. Instead, he led Morty down into the valley, where the gold light was thickest. The air here was warmer, and tiny motes of dust floated like slow snow. In the center of the valley was a low pedestal, carved from the same deep blue moss-covered stone as the ground. On it sat an object Morty couldn't identify. Not a machine, not a rock, not anything familiar. It was a smooth oval, translucent, with faint light swirling inside like smoke. Rick reached out and touched it gently, almost reverently. The light inside brightened for a moment, then dimmed. Morty waited for an explanation, but none came. When they left, Morty kept glancing back at the valley until the ridge blocked it from view. He wondered if the object would still be there tomorrow, or if the shifting suns would erase it. Back in their own world, the late afternoon light felt almost dull after what he'd seen. Morty lingered in the garage as Rick returned to his workbench, scribbling notes in a language Morty couldn't read. Before leaving, Morty asked, "What was that thing in the valley?" Rick didn't look up. "Doesn't matter, kid. Just something that remembers." Morty didn't understand, but he felt the words settle somewhere deep, like a pebble dropped into still water. That night, the dream came again. This time Morty was standing in the valley alone, the sky full of shifting suns. The oval object on the pedestal glowed brighter than before, and when he touched it, he heard a voice, his own, but older, speaking words he couldn't remember upon waking. When he opened his eyes, the black stone was still in his pocket, and next to it somehow was a second one, pale and warm, as though it had been sitting in sunlight. The first time Morty heard the phrase "Library of Ricks," it sounded like a joke, like something Rick would make up to fill an awkward silence, or to mess with him on a slow afternoon. But when the portal opened and Morty stepped through, he realized it wasn't a joke at all. They emerged into a space so vast, Morty's first thought was that they'd landed outside the universe entirely. It wasn't a building, not in the normal sense. There were no walls, no roof, only shelves upon shelves stretching into a haze that had no horizon. Each shelf towered higher than a house, filled with objects that glowed faintly under the dim, perpetual twilight. Some held books, but most held things Morty couldn't name. Jars of swirling light, machines no bigger than a thimble, glass cubes containing frozen moments that moved when you tilted them. And every few aisles, Morty would catch a glimpse of another Rick. Some nodded as they passed. Others ignored them entirely, their heads bent over strange contraptions. Rick walked like he'd been here 1,000 times. His hands stayed in his pockets, his eyes scanning the shelves without stopping. Morty trailed beside him, looking everywhere at once, his neck beginning to ache from trying to take it all in. "What is this place?" Morty whispered, though his voice still echoed slightly in the endless space. Rick's reply was casual. "Every Rick stores their memories somewhere. Some keep them in their heads, some dump them into hard drives. This place is where some of us keep the stuff we can't risk losing." Morty slowed his steps, glancing at a shelf filled entirely with glass bottles, each holding what looked like rain. On the labels, instead of dates, were short sentences. Her first laugh, the day I stopped running, the last sandwich. He wanted to ask about them, but Rick was already turning down another aisle. The Ricks here moved differently than the one Morty knew. Some were quiet, methodical, their expressions heavy with thought. Others seemed softer, in a way Morty couldn't explain. Their movements unhurried, their faces lined not just with age, but with something like peace. It made Morty wonder what his own Rick looked like to the others. They stopped at a narrow shelf tucked into a corner, almost hidden. Here the objects were smaller, scraps of paper, keys, broken bits of metal arranged neatly. Rick reached for a small tin box and opened it without ceremony. Inside was a single photo. Morty leaned closer. It wasn't of him, or of anyone he recognized. Just a girl with dark hair, standing on a bridge, laughing at something beyond the frame. Rick stared at it for a long time, the kind of stillness that made Morty hold his breath without realizing. Then he put the photo back, closed the tin, and returned it to the shelf. Morty waited for him to say something, but the silence stretched until it felt like part of the air itself. Finally, Rick muttered, "Some things you look at, not for answers, but to remember you ever asked the question." They moved on. At one point, they passed a Rick sitting cross-legged on the floor surrounded by open journals. This Rick looked up and gave Morty a small nod, his eyes kind in a way that caught him off guard. Morty nodded back without knowing why. The deeper they went, the quieter the library became. The other Ricks were fewer here, and the shelves held stranger things. Sealed envelopes that rattled when moved, lanterns that glowed only when someone stood near, a single red shoe resting in a case like a priceless artifact. They stopped again, this time in front of a tall cabinet with dozens of drawers. Rick slid one open, revealing row after row of small, flat stones. Each had a faint mark carved into it. Not letters, not numbers, just simple shapes. Rick picked one up and handed it to Morty. It was cool to the touch, its surface worn smooth. The shape carved into it was a circle broken by a single line. "What's this?" Morty asked. Rick shrugged. "Depends who you ask. For me, it's the day I met you." Morty looked up sharply, but Rick had already turned, sliding the drawer shut. He didn't ask again. Somehow, the stone in his palm felt heavier than its size should allow. As they made their way back toward the portal, Morty noticed the light in the library shifting. It was subtle, like the dimmest stars beginning to show in a twilight sky. He wondered if time moved here, or if the change was just another memory being stored somewhere, altering the air itself. Before stepping through the portal, Morty glanced over his shoulder. From here, the shelves seemed endless, a labyrinth of what every Rick had decided was worth keeping. It struck him that each object, no matter how small, had been chosen, saved, carried through countless worlds and years because it mattered to someone. Back in the garage, the hum of the fluorescent lights felt loud after the library's hush. Rick set the portal gun on the bench and reached into his coat. Without a word, he handed Morty the stone from the drawer. Morty held it carefully, as though it might fade if he wasn't gentle. "Why are you giving me this?" Rick's voice was quieter than usual. "Because if I keep it, it's just a memory. If you keep it, maybe it becomes something else." That night, Morty placed the stone beside the two others, the dark smooth one from the pool and the pale warm one from the Valley of Suns. They didn't match, but together they looked like the beginning of a set. When he dreamed, the library was there. Only it wasn't filled with Ricks this time. It was just him, walking the aisles alone, each shelf holding a moment from his own life. Some he recognized, some he hadn't lived yet, and somewhere, far in the distance, he thought he heard footsteps. Slow, deliberate, coming closer. Morty used to think listening meant hearing every word someone said. It was simple. You wait until they're done talking, then you nod, or answer, or argue back. But traveling with Rick had shown him that some of the most important things never made it into words at all. It started one night, when the wind outside the garage rattled the loose panel on the roof. Rick was working on something that looked like a toaster, except every time he adjusted a dial, it emitted a low hum that made the floor vibrate. Morty sat nearby, pretending to do homework, but mostly just watching. Rick wasn't talking much. He wasn't drinking either, which was strange enough to make Morty pay attention. Instead, he moved with a kind of focus Morty rarely saw in him, his brow furrowed in a way that wasn't frustration, more like caution. Finally, Morty broke the silence. What's it do?" Rick didn't look up. "It's not about what it does. It's about what it doesn't." Morty frowned. "That doesn't make sense." "Exactly," Rick muttered, tightening a bolt, and then he said nothing else for a long time. At first, Morty thought Rick was just being cryptic again, but after a while he realized there was something in the way Rick's hands hesitated. Just before touching the machine, the way his eyes lingered on a single component, as if waiting for it to speak back. It wasn't words, but it was communication all the same. That night, they went on a short trip. No monsters, no running, no explosions. Just a quick jump to a place Rick called the Hollow Frequency. It was a planet covered in stone arches, each the height of a skyscraper, arranged in patterns Morty's brain couldn't quite make sense of. The wind there carried a constant low whistle, a sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. Rick set the strange toaster machine on the ground beneath one of the arches. "Okay, Morty, this is a listening trip. You're going to think it's boring? It's not. Shut up and listen." So Morty sat. At first, all he could hear was the whistle and the distant scrape of stones shifting in the wind. But the longer he stayed still, the more he began to notice. Small changes in the pitch, faint echoes that answered from far away, even moments where the sound seemed to stop and restart like a breath. Rick closed his eyes and leaned against the arch. For a while, they didn't move. Morty wanted to ask what they were listening for, but he understood that would break it. Eventually, Rick opened one eye and said, "You hear it?" "I hear wind," Morty offered. Rick smirked faintly. "No, you hear the space between the wind." Morty frowned again, but didn't push. Something about the quiet felt fragile. After a while, the machine gave a soft chime. Rick switched it off, picked it up, and without ceremony opened a portal back to the garage. They didn't talk much on the way home. Over the next few weeks, Morty started noticing things, not just with Rick, but everywhere. At school, he realized his teacher's voice slowed when she was about to admit she didn't know an answer. At dinner, his mum's fork paused over her plate a split second before she changed the subject. Even Summer, who usually barreled through conversations like she was breaking down a door, sometimes left half-finished sentences hanging in the air as if she was deciding whether to let them drop. But with Rick, the silences felt different. Sometimes they were shields, sometimes invitations, and sometimes, rarely, but more often than Morty expected, they were confessions that didn't need words. One evening, they ended up at a diner on some nameless asteroid station. It was the kind of place where the tables were always a little sticky, and the coffee tasted faintly metallic. Morty was halfway through a plate of something that claimed to be pancakes when Rick set down his fork and stared out the window. Beyond the glass was nothing but black, deep space, scattered with slow-moving lights. Rick didn't speak for almost a full minute. Then he said quietly, "The thing about infinite universes, Morty, is you can't tell if someone's missing because they're gone, or because you're just in the wrong one." Morty didn't know what to say to that. He didn't even know if Rick meant for him to say anything, so he just nodded once and went back to eating, the words settling in his chest like a stone. Later, back in the garage, Rick handed him a small device. It looked like a pocket radio, but without a speaker. "What's this?" Morty asked. "It's a tuner for silence," Rick said. "Won't make sense now. Keep it. Someday, maybe you'll figure out how to use it." That night, Morty left it on his desk. When he turned off the light, he thought he heard it faintly hum. Not loud enough to be real, but enough to make him keep listening long after he should have been asleep. Weeks passed, adventures blurred together, but Morty noticed himself listening differently, not just to people, but to places, to moments. The pause before a storm, the hesitation before someone laughs. The way Rick's voice sometimes caught on a word he otherwise would have tossed away. One day, without really deciding to, Morty turned the tuner on. It didn't make a sound. Instead, it seemed to pull the room inward, as if every small noise had stepped back to make space for something else. In that stillness, Morty thought he heard footsteps again, slow, steady, not coming closer this time, but walking alongside him somewhere he couldn't see. When he switched it off, the world returned to normal. But the silence stayed with him, tucked into the edges of his thoughts. And for the first time, Morty began to wonder if maybe the most important parts of the multiverse weren't the battles, or the inventions, or the strange planets. Maybe they were the moments so quiet you could almost miss them, the spaces between words where something true was always waiting. It began with an envelope. Not a fancy sci-fi kind of envelope, with blinking seals or holograms. Just paper, a little yellowed, edges curled as though it had been folded and unfolded too many times. Morty found it on the garage workbench one morning, sitting between a half-dismantled ray gun and an open box of wires. Rick wasn't around. The envelope had no name, no address, no markings except for a single faint ink smudge on the back. Inside was a sheet of paper, blank at first glance. Morty tilted it in the light and saw faint lines like the ghost of a drawing. When he held it in both hands, the lines darkened, curling into the beginnings of a map. The map didn't show roads or planets. It didn't even look like it belonged to a single place. Instead, it was all scattered shapes, patches of colour and symbols Morty didn't recognize. A crescent moon inside a square, a line of dots that ended in a spiral, a single drop of water floating above what looked like an eye. When Rick finally came in, he barely glanced at it before muttering, "Oh, that thing, huh?" Morty held it up. "What is it?" "It's a cartographer's paradox," Rick said, rummaging through a pile of metal parts. "It draws where you're going based on what you're feeling, not the other way around." Morty blinked. "Wait, so, like, mood-based GPS?" Rick smirked. "Yeah, except instead of taking you somewhere you want to go, it takes you somewhere you need to go. Usually inconvenient, sometimes dangerous, occasionally fatal. Fun stuff." Before Morty could ask if they had to use it, Rick was already packing a portal gun and a bag of tools. "Come on, let's see what it thinks of you." The first portal opened onto a desert of red glass. Each step crunched under their feet, the shards glinting like frozen fire. The map in Morty's hands shifted, the red glass took shape on the page, and a faint golden line stretched ahead of them, curving toward something unseen. Morty noticed the line waver when he hesitated. When he thought about home, the line thinned. When he thought about what might be waiting out here, it sharpened and grew brighter. The path led them to a single pillar of stone, standing alone in the heat. At the top, balanced like a coin on its edge, was a cube of ice. It didn't melt, even though the air shimmered with heat. Rick didn't explain it. He just tilted his head toward Morty, as if to say, "Your turn." Morty placed a hand on the stone. It was warm, almost hot, but the moment he focused on the cold above, the heat faded. When he climbed down, the map shifted again. The desert faded into an ocean of ink-black water. The next portal took them there. They stood on a tiny dock with no visible land beyond it, just ripples disappearing into the dark. A small rowboat rocked gently at the edge. "This feels," Morty began, but stopped. The map was already changing, drawing the water in thick, flowing strokes. A faint blue circle appeared, and Morty realized it was beneath the surface. Rick handed him a small rebreather. "Better be something good down there," Rick muttered, though his tone was almost careful. They descended into the black. The water was warm, carrying a slow, steady pulse, like a heartbeat far below. When Morty reached the circle from the map, he found nothing but a single seashell resting on the ocean floor. He picked it up. It hummed faintly in his palm. The sound wasn't a note exactly, more like a memory he couldn't quite name. When they returned to the surface, the map showed a final mark. Not a place, but a shape. It was a looping line that doubled back on itself, forming something like an infinity symbol, except broken in the middle. Morty frowned at it. "What's that mean?" Rick took a long look and didn't answer right away. Finally he said, "It means you're not done yet." They followed the last path to a quiet forest, lit by a pale green glow. Leaves shimmered overhead, catching the light in slow waves. In the centre of the clearing stood a mirror, not attached to a wall or frame, just a freestanding pane of glass, tall as a door. When Morty looked into it, he didn't see himself exactly. It was him, but older. Not older like Rick, older like someone who'd carried years on his back without realizing it. The reflection smiled at him, a small, tired smile. Morty lifted a hand. So did the reflection. But when he stepped closer, the reflection didn't move the same way. Instead, it leaned forward slightly and whispered something Morty couldn't hear. The map in his hand turned blank. The paper was still warm, as if the ink had only just faded. Rick walked up beside him, studying the empty page. "That's all it wanted to show you," he said. Morty stared at the mirror, but the reflection was normal now. Just him, same age, same clothes. When he looked down again, the map was gone entirely. The envelope on the garage bench that night was empty. Rick didn't bring it up again, but sometimes when Morty caught Rick watching him for no obvious reason, he thought maybe the map hadn't really disappeared. Maybe it was still drawing lines somewhere he couldn't see, waiting for him to notice where they were leading. Some planets greet you with noise, bustling ports, markets humming with voices, the static crackle of neon signs. Others greet you with silence. This one greeted Morty with recognition. They stepped out of the portal into air that smelled faintly of rain, though the ground was dry. The sky overhead was a deep lavender, streaked with thin threads of gold light that pulsed like veins. In the distance, hills rose and fell in slow, gentle curves, their slopes covered in a shimmering grass that seemed to lean toward him as he passed. It took Morty a minute to realize the people were looking at him, not in the way strangers look, cautious, curious, or disinterested. No, these were the stares of people who already knew him. An old woman in a slate-blue robe paused mid-step and smiled, as if she'd been expecting him for years. A child tugged at their parent's sleeve and pointed. Even the street vendors standing behind tables piled with fruit and folded paper charms offered him nods of quiet familiarity. Morty slowed his pace. Rick?" "Yeah, I see it," Rick said, though his voice was unreadable. He adjusted the settings on his portal gun without looking up. "This place is complicated." "Complicated how?" Rick sighed. "The planet's got a temporal field. Doesn't just mess with clocks, it messes with memory. Here, the past and future aren't in separate drawers. They're mixed up in the same junk pile. So, they know me because they remember you," Rick said. "Not from the past, from their past, which might be your future, or might be one of your futures. Time here's like a lazy river, loops back on itself if you're not paying attention." Morty's stomach sank. He kept walking, trying not to meet too many eyes, but the feeling of being known pressed against him like warm water. It was strange. Part of him found it comforting. Another part felt like he'd walked into a conversation that had started without him. They stopped at a quiet square lined with pale stone buildings. In the centre was a fountain, though no water flowed. Instead, thin streams of light trickled upward from the basin, evaporating into the lavender sky. A man was waiting there, tall, wearing a robe of green and silver, his hair shot through with white. When he saw Morty, he gave a slow, deliberate bow. "Welcome back," the man said. Morty blinked. I think you've got the wrong..." The man raised a hand. "We all carry more than one life inside us, Morty Smith. Yours simply run closer together here." Morty glanced at Rick, but Rick was looking off at the horizon, hands in his coat pockets. The man continued. "You came to us once before, not in this body, not in this year, but you stood here all the same. You told us something, and it changed the way our people think about endings." "What did I say?" Morty asked, his voice almost a whisper. The man's smile was tinged with sadness. "You told us that endings are not stops, but doors, that to lose something is only to step into another room." Morty swallowed, unsure why his chest felt heavy. "That doesn't sound like something I'd say." "Not yet," the man said, "but you will." They walked together to the edge of the square, where the streets narrowed into a winding path that led up the nearest hill. Morty noticed more faces in the crowd, more nods of recognition, some warm, some solemn. One woman even reached out and briefly touched his hand as they passed, as though confirming he was real. When they reached the top, Morty could see the whole valley spread out below. The grass shimmered like water under the strange sky, and the air felt charged with something he couldn't name. "This is where you spoke," the man said quietly, "and where you will again." Morty didn't know what to say. The idea of coming back here, of already having been here, felt like standing on the edge of a deep pool, unsure if he'd already jumped or was about to. Rick finally stepped forward. "All right, Mystic Memory Lane, we're not here for story hour. You got the thing?" The man reached into his robe and pulled out a small crystal, faintly glowing from within. When Morty looked closer, he saw shapes moving inside it. Tiny, shifting patterns like shadows seen through water. "This will keep your paths from tangling too soon," the man said, placing it in Morty's hands. "Use it when you feel the pull of something you are not ready to face." Morty nodded, though he wasn't sure he understood. As they turned to leave, Morty glanced back at the crowd gathering in the square. Some of them waved, some simply stood, watching him with the kind of expression you give someone you've already said goodbye to once. Back, in the portal's green light, Morty hesitated. "Rick, do you think they were telling the truth? That I actually came back here?" Rick's voice was calm, almost gentle. "In a universe this big, Morty, sometimes the question isn't whether something happened, it's whether you'll let it." The portal closed behind them. The crystal was still warm in Morty's hand. The portal spilled them into a narrow street lit by lamps that swayed without wind. The air was thick, as if every sound was padded, wrapped in velvet. Somewhere far away, a bell tolled, slow, unhurried, as though it had all the time in the world. Morty looked up. Above them, the sky was neither day nor night. It was a pale silver grey, like the inside of a half-forgotten dream. Buildings stretched high on either side, their windows soft with dim light, but the walls seemed unfinished, edges blurring into shadow. "Where are we?" Morty asked. Rick's voice was low. "A city that only exists when someone is almost awake. It's built from the last fragments of dreams right before they fade." Morty turned in a slow circle. "So, what happens when people wake up?" Rick shrugged. "The city unravels, streets vanish, buildings melt into the sky, and the people here just wait until someone dreams them back." Morty felt a strange heaviness in his chest. Around them, figures moved slowly, not sluggish exactly, but with the weight of knowing every step was temporary. Some carried paper lanterns that gave off a glow softer than candlelight. Others sat on benches, staring into nothing, as if listening for something just beyond hearing. They passed a cafe with no customers, yet steam curled up from untouched cups on the tables. The smell of coffee hung in the air, rich and comforting, as if the memory of warmth could linger even without hands to hold it. Rick didn't stop walking. "Place is useful," he muttered. "Nobody guards anything here, because technically it's not even real." "Not real?" Morty echoed, glancing at a boy who was trying to catch a paper kite drifting just out of reach. "Not in the waking world," Rick said, "but to the people dreaming it, for those few moments, it's as real as anything else. You ever notice how a dream can feel more real than life if it's the right kind?" Morty thought about it. Yeah, he'd had dreams like that. Ones where he woke up and still felt the ghost of them clinging to him, like a sweater you'd forgotten you were wearing. They came to a wide plaza where the cobblestones shimmered faintly, as though lit from beneath. A fountain sat at the center, but instead of water, it poured sand. Slow, endless, falling into a basin that never filled. A woman stood there, watching the sand fall. Her dress was made of overlapping scraps of paper, each one covered in handwriting so small Morty couldn't read it. When she turned toward them, Morty saw her eyes with a color of early morning, that moment when it's not quite dark anymore, but the sun hasn't yet risen. "Rick Sanchez," she said softly, and her voice carried like a lullaby in an empty room. Rick gave her a brief nod. "Need the key?" She tilted her head. "And what will you give me for it?" Rick reached into his coat and pulled out a small battered music box. When he wound it, the sound that came out was faint and cracked, but strangely beautiful. The kind of tune you couldn't place, but felt like you'd heard long ago. Her gaze softened. "That will do." She reached into the folds of her paper dress and pulled out a key that looked like it had been carved from frost. When Morty touched it, it was cold enough to make his fingers ache. "What's it open?" Morty asked. "A door that doesn't exist yet," she replied. "But when it does, you'll need it." Morty blinked. "How do I know when—" "You'll know," she said simply, then turned back to the fountain, letting the sand fall without end. Rick pocketed the key and motioned for Morty to follow. As they left the plaza, Morty noticed the edges of the buildings were starting to blur more, like someone had smudged them with a thumb. The silver-grey sky flickered faintly. "Rick, is the city—" "Yeah," Rick said. "Someone's waking up." A low hum passed through the air, almost like the sound of a giant breath being taken. Figures in the streets began to fade, their shapes dissolving into mist. The boy with the kite let go of its string and both vanished together, as if they had never been there at all. The cafe disappeared mid-step as Morty walked past it. One moment solid, the next just a gap in the street where the smell of coffee was already gone. They picked up their pace. Rick's voice was tight. "We don't want to be here when it goes." "What happens if we are?" Rick didn't answer, but Morty caught the way his jaw tightened and decided he didn't want to know. They reached a narrow alley where the walls on either side were already fading, leaving strips of pale sky between them. Rick flicked the portal gun to life, the green circle yawning open like a mouth. Morty hesitated for just a second. He glanced back at the city, at the half-seen people, the paper lanterns, the fountains spilling endless sand. He felt a pang, knowing that when they were gone, it would all be nowhere, waiting for another dream to call it back. Then the last bell tolled, and the sound echoed like a sigh through the emptying streets. Rick grabbed Morty's sleeve. "Now, Morty." They stepped through. The city vanished behind them like the memory of a dream you can almost remember, but not quite. The portal let them out into silence. Not the kind of silence that's empty, but the kind that feels full, like an ancient library at midnight, where the air is so dense with memory that even your footsteps seem reluctant to disturb it. Morty's eyes adjusted slowly. They stood in a hall so vast he couldn't see its end. Shelves rose up into darkness, stacked not with books but with jars, millions of them. Each one glowed faintly, like it held a firefly that had forgotten how to flicker. "Rick, where are we?" Morty whispered. Rick's voice came low. "The archive of lost Ricks. Every version of me that's gone, erased, deleted from the multiverse. This is where they end up. Well, pieces of them anyway." Morty swallowed. "Pieces?" "Memories," Rick said. "The moments that defined them. You store enough of those, you get the shape of a person, even if they're not really here anymore." They walked between the towering shelves. Morty saw faint images drifting inside the jars. Ricks with strange hairstyles, Ricks in uniforms, Ricks laughing in ways his Rick never did. Some jars were cracked, their light dim, as if the memory inside was slipping away. From the darkness above, a voice called out, "You're late, Rick Sanchez." A figure descended on a platform of floating paper. They were tall, cloaked in an iridescent fabric that shifted colors like oil on water. Their face was mostly hidden by a mask shaped like an hourglass, but Morty could see eyes the color of ink, deep, still, unreadable. "The archivist," Rick muttered. He didn't sound pleased. "You've been avoiding me," the archivist said. Their voice was calm, but there was a weight behind it, like a door that only opened under great pressure. "Not avoiding," Rick said, "just taking the long way round." The archivist stepped closer. They moved without a sound, as if their feet barely touched the ground. "I keep the stories of those who are gone," they said, turning toward Morty. "Do you know what that means, boy?" Morty shook his head. "It means," the archivist continued, "that the ones you've lost are not truly lost, not while someone remembers. But it also means the burden of memory is heavier than you think." Rick's jaw tightened. "Cut the poetry. You still have it?" The archivist studied him for a long moment, then gestured. From a nearby shelf, a jar floated down into their hand. Inside, Morty saw a Rick unlike any he'd ever imagined. Hair tied back, eyes soft, wearing a weathered lab coat covered in hand-painted constellations. This Rick looked kind. The archivist held the jar out. "This one mattered," they said. "More than you know." Rick took it, but didn't open it. His fingers lingered on the glass, almost reverent, before he slipped it into his coat. "What's in it?" Morty asked. Rick didn't answer. The archivist did. A moment he never wanted to forget, but the universe made him forget anyway. Morty frowned. "If he's gone, why give it to you?" "Because," the archivist said softly, "Rick Sanchez is not good at carrying grief. He turns it into something sharp so no one can touch it. But sometimes it needs to be carried whole." Rick shot them a glare. "I didn't come here for a therapy session." The archivist tilted their head. "Then why did you come, Rick? You never take without leaving something behind." Rick hesitated, then reached into his coat again. He pulled out a small broken device, nothing Morty recognized, just a mess of wires and scorched metal. The archivist took it carefully. "You always bring me your failures," they said. "Not failures," Rick replied. "Lessons." A pause. Then the archivist leaned closer to Morty, their masked face inches from his. "You've seen him in many worlds," they said, "but you have not yet seen the truth that runs through them all. When you do, you'll understand why I keep this place." Morty shivered. "Why? What's the truth?" The archivist straightened. "That even in infinity, nothing truly lasts." They turned away. Rick motioned for Morty to follow, his face unreadable. They walked in silence, passing shelf after shelf, each jar a fragment of someone who used to be. At the far end of the hall, they reached a door that wasn't really a door, just an outline in the air, shimmering faintly. Rick pressed the frost key from the dream city into it. The outline shuddered, then swung open into somewhere else entirely. Before stepping through, Morty glanced back. The archivist was watching them from the shadows, the hourglass mask glinting faintly. "Morty," they called softly, "when the time comes, remember, not all memories are meant to be kept. Some will keep you." The door closed behind them. The door closed with a sound like wind dying. When Morty opened his eyes, there was no ground, no sky, just the slow, endless turning of a black ocean. The water was calm, but it moved in impossible ways, folding in on itself, carrying reflections of places that didn't exist. And out in the middle of that ocean stood a lighthouse. It was thin, impossibly tall, its stone walls patched with rusted metal plates, as if it had been repaired by a dozen different hands over centuries. A single white light swept across the waves, cutting through the dark. It didn't seem to be searching for ships. It seemed to be searching for worlds. Rick stepped onto a narrow wooden dock that jutted out toward it. Morty followed, the planks creaking underfoot. The air was thick here, not wet, but heavy, like a held breath. As they approached, Morty saw the lighthouse's base rise out of the ocean on the back of something that wasn't stone at all. Beneath the barnacles and chains there were scales. The whole structure shifted slowly, as if the creature beneath it was asleep. Rick," Morty said. "Yeah, don't think about it," Rick replied. "It's not dangerous unless you try to name it." They reached the tower's entrance, a heavy iron door. Rick knocked 3 times. The sound echoed out across the water like it had a long way to travel before finding anything to bounce off. The door opened. An old man stood there, his beard tangled with bits of rope and glass, his coat stitched together from dozens of different fabrics. His eyes were pale, almost silver, and they didn't quite focus on Morty, or maybe they focused on too many versions of Morty all at once. "Rick Sanchez," the man said, voice low. "You still keeping the light burning, Athel?" Rick asked. The man nodded once. "Come inside. The tide's turning strange." The interior of the lighthouse was not a spiral staircase, as Morty expected, but a series of suspended platforms linked by chains. Each platform swayed slightly, and on each one sat a different machine. Screens, gauges, crystal spheres, and things Morty couldn't name. They pulsed and ticked in unison, like a heartbeat. As they climbed, Morty asked, "So, what exactly do you do here?" Athel glanced back. "I watch for what slips between. Whole worlds get lost out there. Sometimes they wash up here, sometimes something else does." Rick smirked. He's the guy who sees it first when a universe starts leaking into the wrong place. He's also the guy who lets you know when it's time to leave. Morty frowned. Leave, like, forever? Athel stopped. Yes, before you end up like the last Rick who came here. Morty blinked. Wait, what happened to him? They reached the top platform. From here, Morty could see the light itself. Not a bulb, but a sphere of liquid glass, swirling with galaxies. It was beautiful in a way that made his chest ache. Athel walked over to a panel of switches and dials. The last Rick thought he could outrun a collapsing reality, he said. Thought he could repair it from the outside. Morty swallowed. And? Athel turned one of the dials slowly. The sphere's glow dimmed, and within its swirling surface Morty saw something dark, a shape like a man, floating, still. The figure's face was obscured, but Morty could make out the outline of a lab coat. He made it as far as here, Athel said quietly. Then the tide caught him, pulled him somewhere even I can't see. Morty stepped closer to the sphere. The shape inside didn't move. It was as if the universe had turned the man into an idea, and then forgotten what the idea was for. Rick spoke without looking at it. Different me, he told Morty. Not my fate, not if I can help it. Athel's pale eyes studied Rick. Yet you're still carrying the frost key, he said. Rick's hand went to his coat pocket instinctively. You know where it leads? Athel asked. Rick didn't answer. Athel smiled faintly. Of course you do, but you also know what's waiting there. Morty looked between them. What's waiting there? Athel turned away, adjusting the beam of the lighthouse. Not my place to say. The tide's turning faster than it should. If you're going, you'd better go soon. Rick stepped toward the exit platform. Appreciate the warning, he said. We'll be careful. Athel's voice followed them as they began the descent. No one's careful in the end, Rick. Not when they're chasing something they've already lost. Back on the dock, Morty glanced up at the beams sweeping slowly across the infinite black. It passed over them once, and for a moment Morty thought he saw himself. Not standing on the dock, but somewhere far away, looking back at the lighthouse from another shore. Rick, Morty said quietly. You think the last Rick? He was looking for the same thing we're looking for? Rick didn't break stride. Probably, he said. Difference is, Morty, I don't make the same mistakes twice. Morty hesitated. Somewhere deep in the water beneath the lighthouse's living foundation, he thought he heard something move. Slow, massive, and old enough to have forgotten its own name. The dock ended. Rick opened another portal. The colours on the other side were colder than usual, and Morty had the feeling they were stepping into a place that didn't welcome visitors. As they crossed through, the lighthouse's beam swept one last time over the black ocean. And in its light, for just a heartbeat, Morty thought he saw the figure in the lab coat from the sphere, standing on the waves, watching them leave. The portal dropped them into a city that felt alive in a way Morty had never experienced. Buildings were tall, angular, and ever-shifting. Their surfaces rippled as though made of liquid metal. Windows opened and closed of their own accord, revealing rooms that had existed only a moment ago. Even the streets seemed to breathe, widening and narrowing, curling into themselves like slow-moving smoke. Morty paused. Rick, it feels weird, like the city is thinking. Rick glanced around, expression tight. It's worse than that. This place is hungry. Hungry? Rick nodded. The city eats its own past to survive. Memories, events, history, and it folds them in, digests them, makes room for new stuff. Anything that doesn't move fast enough gets swallowed. Morty shivered. He looked up at a clock tower that had just appeared a block away. Its hands were spinning backward, then forward, then pausing mid-air before vanishing entirely. Rick moved on, hands in his coat pockets, scanning the streets. Morty followed, feeling like each step might vanish under him. A group of children ran past, giggling, but as they passed, their laughter faded, and Morty realized that a few steps behind them, the air where they had been was already blank, like the city had swallowed their echoes. Rick, what happens to the stuff it eats? Morty asked quietly. Rick didn't answer right away. Finally, he said, it keeps it. Somewhere deep in the foundations, buried, compressed, Sometimes it gets buried so deep even the city forgets it's there. Other times, it leaks back out in ways you don't want. Morty swallowed. Like? Rick waved toward a square ahead. A man stood there repeating the same motion over and over, raising a hand to his face, then lowering it, again and again. Each repetition grew slightly slower, then faster, until his movements were jagged and broken. And Morty realized he'd seen this man somewhere before, in another city, another universe, another version of a moment that had already passed. It keeps you trapped in the same loop, Rick said. The city feeds off the continuity you take for granted. People think they're living their lives, but the city's already rearranging it for them. Morty's stomach knotted. He thought about the frost key in his pocket, the crystal from the planet where time looked back, the archivist's words. Everything felt connected, yet fragile, like the string of a kite caught in a storm. They reached a market street where stalls appeared out of nowhere. Vendors called to them, but their voices were fragmented, broken into pieces, as though each word was being chewed and spat out by the city itself. Morty caught sight of a young woman behind a fruit stand. Her hair glimmered like silver threads. When she looked at him, her eyes seemed familiar, not a memory from his own life, but from somewhere he had only glimpsed. Before he could speak, she vanished, leaving the stall behind like it had never existed. Rick muttered, "Keep moving. Don't get attached. The city'll eat you next." Morty followed, heart pounding. The streets twisted, and soon they found themselves in a library. Not ordinary shelves, but infinite rows of books that seemed to pulse with life. Titles flickered in and out, sentences dissolved mid-word, paragraphs collapsed into nothingness. At the center, an old librarian stood. Her skin was pale, her eyes deep wells of quiet sorrow. She held a feathered quill, scratching words onto a page that dissolved as soon as it was written. "You're here to retrieve something," she said. Her voice was soft, almost apologetic. "The city has taken pieces of what you carry and left them scattered. To leave here, you must replace them." Morty glanced at Rick. "Replace what?" Rick's eyes narrowed. "He means the frost key," he muttered under his breath. "The city will chew it up if we're not careful." The librarian lifted her gaze to him. "You cannot take without leaving," she said. "A memory, a moment, something that anchors you, or it will all be lost." Morty's hand went to his chest, to the moment he carried inside him, the cube of ice in the desert, the seashell beneath black water, the whispering mirror in the forest, the city at the edge of sleep. He realized if he left any of it behind, the city would swallow it, and perhaps some of it might never return. He reached out, closing his eyes, letting the memory of his first encounter with Rick slip softly into the air. The city shivered. Walls shifted. A stairwell appeared where there had been nothing. The path ahead cleared. Rick patted his shoulder. "Good job. Just don't think about it too long, Morty. That's how people vanish." They moved quickly now, the streets folding behind them like a wave retreating. Buildings they had walked past moments ago now shimmered, warped, then disappeared entirely. Morty felt the tug of lost memories, echoes of people, places, and moments that the city had already consumed. But he focused on the next step, the next heartbeat, the next quiet movement. At the edge of the city, the water began to shimmer. It was the same dark, folding water he had seen at the lighthouse. Rick glanced back at the city one last time. "Remember, Morty," he said softly, "the past is not always yours to hold. Sometimes you let it go. Otherwise, it eats you first." Morty nodded, still breathing heavily. He watched the city shrink behind them as they stepped onto the dock and through the next portal. Somewhere behind the folding streets and devouring walls, the librarian remained, writing sentences that dissolved before the ink could dry. And somewhere, in the space between, the city continued to eat, folding the past into its endless appetite. He portal opened into a place that smelled faintly of honey and old paper. Morty stepped forward carefully. The ground was soft, almost moss-like, and beneath their feet tiny lights pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat. All around him were plants, but they weren't ordinary plants. Leaves shimmered with colour that shifted with the angle of his gaze, petals folded and unfolded like breathing, and vines moved slowly, curling as if listening. Rick was already walking ahead, his hands brushing against the strange flora. "Welcome to the garden," he said quietly. Morty turned to look at him. "The garden?" Rick nodded. "Yeah. Place where Ricks come when they start forgetting themselves. All the little details, the memories they didn't mean to lose. They drift here. Sometimes the mind can't hold it all, and pieces end up in the garden." Morty frowned. "You mean this is like a graveyard?" Rick shook his head. "No, Morty, not a graveyard. Think of it more like a waiting room. Stuff waits here until someone remembers, or doesn't." Morty walked slowly. He noticed a tree with branches like glass, tiny lights trapped inside each twig. When he touched one, a fleeting memory flashed before his eyes, a Rick laughing quietly in a dark room, building something with precise, careful hands. The light flickered, then vanished. "This is sad," Morty whispered. Rick didn't answer. He simply continued down a winding path where the air grew thick with whispers. Not loud, not urgent, but soft, like a lullaby you can almost hear if you quiet your mind enough. Morty reached a small clearing. On the ground were jars, tiny vials, and delicate scrolls, scattered like fallen leaves. He picked up a jar. Inside was a flickering image, a Rick, hunched over a bench, staring at a map of stars he could no longer chart. "Why do they forget?" Morty asked, voice low. Rick crouched beside him. Too many Ricks, too many timelines. Memories pile up. Some get compressed, some leak, some just fade. This garden catches what's lost so it doesn't vanish entirely. But even here, it's temporary. Morty's chest tightened. He held the jar gently, as if it could shatter if he breathed too hard. It was strange, seeing someone else's memory, knowing it was both real and not real at the same time. Rick moved forward, coming to a large fountain at the center of the clearing. Instead of water, it flowed with mist that glimmered faintly, reflecting shards of countless lives. Around it, Rick sat quietly, each lost in their own thoughts, staring into the mist as if it held the answers to questions they no longer remembered asking. Morty looked closer. Some of them wore clothes he recognized, coats patched with strange symbols, lab coats scorched at the edges, glasses askew. They didn't notice him. They were lost in the slow, gentle unspooling of themselves. "This is kind of beautiful," Morty said, barely above a whisper. "Yeah," Rick replied. "Beauty and sadness are cousins here. The garden doesn't judge. It just holds." A wind stirred, carrying the scent of something sweet and forgotten. One of the Ricks stirred, slowly lifting a hand to touch the mist. As he did, a faint image of another Morty appeared beside him. Not Morty himself, but a version from a timeline that might have been. The Ricks looked at their Mortys, smiled faintly, then returned to their quiet contemplation. Morty stepped back, feeling both awe and melancholy. He realized that this place didn't demand attention or action. It simply existed, holding what could not be held elsewhere. Rick knelt beside a vine that curled gently over the fountain. He whispered something, and the vine responded, twisting to reveal a small, glowing bud. Morty watched as the bud opened, releasing a soft light that illuminated the faces of the lost Ricks around them. Each flicker of illumination seemed to anchor a memory, just for a moment, before it drifted again into the mist. "Rick," Morty said, "do you ever forget yourself?" Rick's gaze didn't waver from the vine. "Of course I do, Morty. That's why I come here sometimes. Helps me remember what's worth keeping, and what's okay to let go." Morty swallowed. He thought about everything he had carried, the frost key, the crystal, the city that ate its past, the lighthouse watching over worlds. He realized that even Rick, for all his bluster and bravado, had moments like these, moments where the universe was too much, and all you could do was breathe and let the quiet hold you. A faint rustle came from the far edge of the clearing. Morty saw a figure approaching, tall, draped in a cloak of soft green. It was familiar, though he couldn't place it at first. As it drew nearer, he recognized the archivist, pale eyes glinting softly. "You've done well," the archivist said. "You're learning, Morty. Not all Ricks are meant to be saved. Not all memories are meant to be held. Sometimes holding your own is enough." Morty nodded, feeling a strange peace settle in his chest. The garden wasn't frightening. It wasn't hostile. It simply existed, cradling what the rest of the universe could not, and giving those who wandered through it the quiet space to remember, to breathe, to be. Rick rose, brushing dirt from his coat. "All right, Morty, time to move on. We've lingered too long here, and the garden likes its privacy." Morty looked back at the fountain, at the soft lights in the vines and jars. He realized that when they left, the Ricks here wouldn't vanish completely. They'd continue in the garden, waiting quietly in the shadows of memory, softly pulsing in rhythm with the universe. As they stepped toward the portal, Morty felt something he hadn't expected. Gratitude for the garden, for Rick, for the slow, gentle moments that reminded him of what mattered, even when the world was chaotic and infinite. And somewhere in that quiet, he knew that even if he forgot 1,000 small things tomorrow, this moment, this place, would stay with him, tucked gently in the corners of his mind. Rick stepped into the portal first, then Morty followed. The garden shimmered behind them, a living memory fading slowly into the folds of the multiverse. But Morty felt certain. The light, the quiet, the forgotten pieces would always be waiting, quietly, patiently, in the space between worlds. The portal opened onto a town where every sound seemed measured. Footsteps, distant bells, even the whisper of wind, all moved in precise rhythm, as if time itself had slowed to a gentle pulse. Morty noticed the streets were lined with small shops, each one filled with clocks, gears, and delicate mechanisms that spun endlessly. Some clocks ticked backward, some skipped beats, some glowed with soft light instead of hands. Rick led the way to the largest building, a tall, spiraling tower that hummed faintly, vibrating with energy Morty couldn't name. The door opened before they touched it, revealing a workshop larger than the town itself. Inside, hundreds of clocks hung from the ceiling, perched on shelves, even floating in midair. Each one moved to its own tempo, yet together they formed a quiet symphony, a heartbeat you could almost fall asleep to. At a long workbench stood a figure hunched over a small device. The person's hair was silver and tangled, pulled back with care, and their fingers moved with infinite patience, adjusting gears so tiny Morty could barely see them. The clockmaker looked up and smiled faintly. "Ah, visitors. I wondered when someone would arrive who needed to see the value of a single second." Rick grunted. "Yeah, Morty here. He's still learning." The clockmaker's eyes, pale and still, studied Morty. "You have to learn, young one," they said softly. "Not all time is measured by clocks. Some seconds stretch into eternity, some compress into a heartbeat, and some, well, slip away if you're not careful." Morty nodded slowly. He felt the weight of the room, the slow, deliberate pulse of every second vibrating around him. It was almost impossible to breathe without feeling the rhythm. "Why? Why do you keep all these clocks?" Morty asked, gesturing to the hundreds surrounding them. The clockmaker smiled. "Because every clock holds a memory. Every tick is a moment that someone lived, somewhere. Some are joyful, some sorrowful, some forgotten. If I do not tend to them, they dissolve, and some moments are too precious to lose." Rick muttered. "This one's older than any council or archive we've seen. Keeps track of things even I can't cheat." Morty's eyes drifted to a small, golden pocket watch lying on the workbench. It glimmered faintly, and when he leaned closer, he thought he saw a younger version of himself inside, laughing with Rick in a moment he didn't remember. "Can I?" Morty asked quietly. "Can I hold it?" The clockmaker shook their head gently. "Number. Not yet. Time like that can only be carried by its own heartbeat, but you may see it, and that is enough." Morty felt a tug at his chest, a strange warmth, a reminder that even if he forgot later, the feeling of this second would remain. Rick leaned in, whispering, "Pay attention, Morty. It's not the clocks that matter. It's the moments between the ticks." Morty blinked. "Between the ticks?" Rick nodded. "Yeah, that's where the universe grows. That's where the memories, the choices, the little quiet things hide. That's where we live." The clockmaker picked up a small gear, turning it slowly between their fingers. "Morty," they said, "sometimes you chase time thinking it moves in a straight line. It does not. It spirals, folds, doubles back on itself, and the beauty, the real beauty, is noticing it when it does." Morty felt the room slow even more, as if the world itself was leaning in to listen. He realized he had been rushing, looking for answers, moving from portal to portal, chasing the next moment without savoring the ones he had. He watched as the clockmaker set the gear into a small machine. It spun, releasing a soft glow, and the glow traveled to a series of clocks along the ceiling. One by one, their hands paused, then moved gently in perfect harmony, like a choir of moments finally in tune. "See," the clockmaker said, "some seconds need a guide, some seconds need patience, and some just need you to stop and breathe." Morty nodded, closing his eyes. He let the hum of clocks wash over him, felt the pulse of countless seconds nesting in his chest, each one carrying a fragment of life he had yet to understand. Rick adjusted a dial on one of the floating clocks, then whispered to Morty, "You notice how the clockmaker doesn't measure by hours or minutes? That's the lesson. Moments are bigger than numbers, bigger than what you think you see." Morty opened his eyes again. The room was calm, glowing, almost breathing with the soft rhythm of endless seconds. He realized that even the clocks that ticked backward or skipped or paused entirely were teaching him something, that every moment mattered, even the ones he thought he'd lost. The clockmaker leaned close and whispered in a voice only Morty could hear, "Carry this with you, Morty. Some days the universe will rush, some days it will stall. But the seconds you notice, the ones you feel, those are the ones that shape you." Morty took a slow breath. He understood, in a way he hadn't before, that time wasn't something you chased. It was something you lived between, quietly, carefully, in the soft folds of the universe where the noise faded and only the heartbeat remained. Rick clapped him on the shoulder. "All right, Morty, enough philosophy for now. Let's get moving before the next second eats itself." Morty smiled faintly. He took one last look around the workshop, at the clock suspended in midair, at the soft glow of memories preserved in gear and glass. He felt a calmness he hadn't known he was capable of, a quiet awe at the gentle power of moments, and the patience it took to notice them. The portal opened, waiting for them. Morty stepped through slowly, carrying the echo of every second, the pulse of countless quiet moments, tucked gently into his chest. And somewhere behind them, the clockmaker returned to their work, guiding the seconds of the universe with careful hands, invisible but present in every heartbeat that followed. The portal spat them out beside a river that moved in slow, deliberate ripples, though the water shimmered with colours Morty couldn't name. Rick stepped onto the bank, boots pressing lightly into the soft glassy sand. Morty followed, watching the currents twist in spirals, fold back on themselves, and then drift away. It wasn't a river of water, it was a river of possibilities. Every choice, every small decision ever made by any version of Morty, Rick, or someone in between, flowed here, quietly, endlessly, invisibly shaping the course of worlds. Morty knelt by the edge, dipping a finger into the current. Ripples spread outward, each one glowing faintly, then vanishing. "Rick," he said softly, "is all of this real?" Rick didn't answer immediately. He just stood beside him, watching the river as if it had been there forever. Finally, he spoke. "Real doesn't matter, Morty. What matters is effect. Every choice, even the ones you forget you made, flows somewhere. Some choices get noticed. Some get swallowed by the tide." Morty traced the flow with his hand, following tiny spirals that formed, twisted, then disappeared. "I can see myself here," he murmured. "All the times I said yes, and all the times I said no." Rick nodded. "Exactly. And you'll see, Morty. There's no judgment here, no right or wrong, just the quiet hum of everything you ever did and everything you didn't. Sometimes it's beautiful. Sometimes it's heartbreaking." Morty leaned back, closing his eyes, listening, Even the soft lap of the current against the shore felt like a lullaby. For a moment he thought he could hear whispers, faint echoes of laughter, of tears, of quiet words not spoken. Why is it so calm? Morty asked. It should be chaotic, he added. Rick smiled faintly. That's the trick, Morty. Chaos is easy. Calm takes noticing. Quiet noticing. The river doesn't need to shout. It just flows. And if you watch closely, you understand more than if you screamed at it. Morty took a deep breath, feeling the current brush against him like a soft hand. He imagined all the small decisions he had made, skipping a step, staying up too late, saying a word instead of another. And in this place they mattered. They moved gently in a rhythm, carrying fragments of lives, echoes of small kindnesses, moments of hesitation and fleeting bravery. Rick knelt beside him, plucking a small glowing pebble from the shore. This is one of yours, he said quietly. A choice you didn't even realize you made. You stayed calm when things went wrong, even though you wanted to panic. The ripple of that. It carried further than you know. Morty stared at the pebble. It glimmered faintly, reflecting light that seemed older than the universe itself. He felt warmth in his chest. Not pride, not fear, just understanding. You see, Morty, Rick continued, this river, it's not about seeing the future. It's about feeling it. Every choice matters in ways you'll never know, and yet it all blends into something quietly beautiful. The world isn't broken. It just flows. Morty nodded slowly. He let his hands hover above the river, imagining each ripple as a gentle wave of memory and consequence. Some were bright and glowing, others dim, almost invisible, but each one moved with care, folding into the next, joining the current of the universe in a slow, harmonious pattern. A soft wind stirred, brushing through the colours of the river and rustling the strange trees along the bank. It carried faint laughter, some his, some another Morty's, some belonging to a Rick long forgotten. He realized that even lost moments were not truly gone. They became part of the river, and the river carried them forward, silently, patiently. Rick patted him on the shoulder. Time and choices, Morty. That's what matters in the end. Not the grand gestures, not the explosions or crises. It's the small, quiet moments you hold on to, and the ones you let drift. Morty watched the current for a long while, letting each tiny movement settle in his chest. He thought of the garden where Rick's forgot, of the clockmaker tending infinite seconds, of the lighthouse keeping watch over lost worlds, and he realized that this river, slow, endless, and gentle, was all of those things combined. Do we follow it? Morty asked. Rick smiled, looking at the shimmer of possibilities stretching ahead. No, Morty, you don't follow the river. You walk beside it, feel it, learn from it, and when it's time, step into the next moment with what you've carried. Morty nodded, letting the words settle. He felt a calmness he hadn't known he was capable of, a quiet understanding that every small decision mattered, and that even when choices were lost or forgotten, they were still part of something larger. They walked along the shore, leaving ripples behind that slowly disappeared into the flowing light. Every step was deliberate, slow, measured, a gentle rhythm that matched the pulse of the river. And somewhere deep in the water, beneath the colours and currents, Morty thought he saw tiny figures of himself and Rick, echoes of decisions yet to be made, floating quietly, patiently, in the endless fold of possibility. Rick glanced at him, voice soft. Remember, Morty, the river doesn't judge, it doesn't rush, it doesn't scream, it just flows. And somewhere along the way, you'll understand why that's enough. Morty smiled faintly, letting the quiet pulse of the river fill him. For the first time in a long while, he didn't feel lost. He felt part of the current, part of the soft, infinite, quiet flow that carried all choices, all moments, and all hearts. And with each step beside Rick, he knew that even if he forgot, even if he wandered far, the river would always be there, gentle, patient, and endlessly forgiving. The portal opened onto a quiet room that smelled faintly of lavender and old wood. At the center stood a large mirror, taller than Morty, its frame carved with shapes that seemed alive. Curling leaves, tiny stars, soft waves frozen mid-motion. The surface was smooth, unbroken, reflecting not just light but something deeper. Morty stepped closer, feeling a pull, as if the mirror was inviting him to look beyond the room, beyond himself. Rick followed, hands behind his back, his usual restlessness softened by the calm of this place. "This," he said quietly, "isn't just a mirror. Well, it shows you what might be. All the possible paths, all the choices you could make tomorrow, next week, 10 years from now. Not the future exactly, more like a whisper of it." Morty swallowed. He peered into the glass, and for a moment he saw a version of himself running through a city of lights, laughing with Rick by his side. Then another version, sitting alone on a dock, staring at the same black water they had visited before. Another still, curled under a tree, reading quietly as the sun sank into colours Morty had never imagined. The images shifted, flowing seamlessly from one to another. They weren't ordered, weren't labelled, weren't fixed. They simply existed, gentle possibilities suspended in time. Morty shivered. "It's a lot," he whispered. Rick nodded. "Yeah, most people panic when they see it. Too many choices, too many what-ifs. But here's the trick, Morty. You don't have to pick all of them. You just notice, learn from them, let them fold into who you already are." Morty focused on a reflection where he was older, calmer, moving through a quiet street, smiling at a stranger. He felt a warmth there, soft and steady. He realized it wasn't about which path was right or wrong. It was about seeing that even in infinite possibilities, kindness, patience, and quiet awareness remained constant. The mirror shifted again, showing a version of Rick he hadn't recognized. Not reckless, not gruff, not sarcastic, but tender, attentive, carrying small comforts to those he cared for. Morty felt a lump in his throat. It was strange, seeing Rick this way. A gentle reminder that even someone as brilliant and wild as him could be soft, could choose carefully, could shape tomorrow in subtle, meaningful ways. Rick noticed Morty's gaze lingering. "Don't get too attached," he said softly. "These are just echoes, possibilities. They're not reality, and they're not guaranteed. But they're lessons, Morty. Each one tells you something about what matters and what doesn't." Morty nodded slowly. He realized he didn't want to panic, didn't want to fixate on fear or regret. Instead, he let the mirror show him quietly, breathing, soft, infinite lessons tucked into light and reflection. A breeze drifted through the room, carrying the faint scent of the garden, the lighthouse, and the river. Morty closed his eyes, letting the calm from all the worlds they had visited wash over him. Each lesson, each gentle reminder, each quiet heartbeat he had witnessed. They all converged here, like threads weaving a tapestry he could carry inside himself. When he opened his eyes, the mirror shifted again, revealing a version of himself smiling at Rick. It wasn't a grand smile, or forced. It was small, real, rooted in understanding. Morty realized, no matter what happened in the infinite paths ahead, this version of himself, patient, kind, aware, could exist. And that was enough. Rick placed a hand on his shoulder. "You ready to step back into the chaos?" he asked, voice calm. Morty nodded. The portal behind them shimmered, the familiar colors calling. Morty took one last look at the mirror. He didn't need to memorize all the possibilities. He only needed to remember that even in infinite tomorrows, the quiet choices, the gentle moments, and the small acts of understanding mattered most. As they stepped through the portal together, Morty felt a deep, soft exhale rise from his chest. All the echoes of memory, the lessons of the garden, the rhythm of the clockmaker's seconds, the flow of the river, they moved with him, tucked safely inside. And somewhere, far beyond the mirror, the infinite possibilities continued to shimmer. Morty knew he couldn't see them all. He didn't need to. Rick clapped him on the back. "Remember, Morty, life's not about seeing every possible tomorrow. It's about walking through today with what you've learned. That's the real adventure." Morty smiled faintly, letting the warmth of understanding linger. He realized that even if he forgot some lessons later, the calm, the quiet, the gentle flow of moments, they would always remain tucked deep in his chest like a heartbeat he could carry anywhere. The portal closed behind them. The mirror remained, waiting quietly for the next traveller, reflecting whispers of what could be, and always softly reminding them to notice. And somewhere, Morty thought, across infinite realities, the small, gentle choices of every Rick and Morty were drifting together like a soft, endless song. It was calm, it was quiet, it was perfect, and with that, he stretched into the stars. The portal opened above a world that was all sky. Morty blinked against the soft light, squinting at clouds that stretched endlessly in every direction. They weren't ordinary clouds. They glimmered like spun silver, drifting slowly, folding over themselves, and leaving trails of gentle luminescence behind. The air was cool and fragrant, filled with a quiet hum of wind that carried faint whispers of distant moments. Rick hovered beside him, kicking off from a cloud as if it were solid ground. "Welcome to the cloudscape," he said, voice soft. "This is where echoes live. Echoes of words, laughter, sighs, promises, the small things that linger longer than they should." Morty stepped forward, feeling the clouds cushion his feet like water. He reached out and touched one. It rippled like silk under his fingers. A whisper brushed his ear, a "thank you" from a version of himself he hadn't known existed. He pulled back, startled, then smiled softly. Rick floated closer. "Most people ignore the echoes," he said, "but the quiet ones, the ones that stick, they tell you who you really are. Not who you want to be, not who you think you should be, who you are." Morty walked slowly, following the faint trail of glowing clouds. Each one shimmered with fragments of life, moments he had forgotten, memories from timelines he had never touched, words spoken and never heard. He realized that even lost things could still exist, softly, waiting to be noticed. A small cloud drifted toward him, curling around his wrist like a ribbon. Morty heard a voice, gentle and kind, whispering, "You did the right thing, even if it didn't seem like it." He closed his eyes, letting the warmth wash over him. The echo wasn't from any moment he remembered clearly. It was from somewhere deeper, a reminder that even small actions mattered. Rick landed on a wider cloud, gesturing for Morty to follow. "See that?" he said. A cluster of clouds ahead glowed brighter than the rest. "That's a memory ripple. It's strong because it carried meaning. Love, care, regret, understanding. These are the clouds that shape the heart." Morty stepped closer, feeling the soft hum of the light. He realized that every echo, every whisper was a thread connecting him to infinite possibilities. Versions of himself, versions of Rick, and moments they had shared and lost. A breeze lifted a thin veil of cloud, revealing the outline of a figure. It was a Rick he had never seen before, standing quietly with a small smile. Morty felt something familiar in him, a quiet kindness, a patience Morty hadn't noticed in other Ricks. The figure waved briefly and then dissolved into the shimmering air. Morty turned to Rick. "Why do we see some and not others?" Rick shrugged. "The echoes choose you, Morty. You can't force it. Only notice, only feel, and sometimes only forgive." Morty nodded slowly. He thought about the garden, the river, the clockmaker, and the mirror. Everything was connected. Moments, memories, choices, all carried in gentle patterns he was only beginning to understand. A soft gust carried him higher, and he realized the cloudscape stretched endlessly above and below. Every ripple, every whisper, every glow was a reminder that nothing was ever truly gone. Even mistakes, even losses, even forgotten laughter. It all floated here, waiting to be recognized. Rick placed a hand on his shoulder. "Morty, don't be afraid of echoes. They aren't ghosts, they're reminders. That's why we notice them. That's why we keep moving." Morty looked down at the glowing clouds beneath him. He realized that life, infinite as it seemed, had a rhythm. A quiet, gentle rhythm where even the smallest echoes mattered. Where even forgotten words, carried softly by the wind, could shape someone's heart. They floated in silence for a while, letting the cloudscape hum through them, feeling the gentle pulse of infinite echoes. Morty knew he could stay here forever, listening to the whispers of possibilities, but he also knew that the next step, the next portal, would call him onward. Rick smiled faintly. Time to go, Morty, but remember, the echoes follow you, always. You just have to notice them. Morty took a last breath of the cool, fragrant air. He felt the echoes wrap gently around him, not heavy, not sad, just soft and warm. He stepped into the portal behind Rick, carrying with him the quiet, infinite hum of the cloudscape. And somewhere, floating in the endless sky, the echoes continued their slow, gentle dance. They shimmered, they whispered, and they waited patiently for anyone willing to listen. The portal opened into a place that smelled of parchment and rain, a library that seemed impossibly vast. Morty blinked, taking in the high shelves that stretched beyond the clouds, filled with books, scrolls, and manuscripts that pulsed faintly with soft light. The air hummed with quiet energy, as though every word contained a heartbeat, and every sentence whispered to those willing to listen. Rick stepped forward, hands in pockets, eyes scanning the endless rows. "Welcome, Morty. This isn't a normal library. This is the library of half-known truths. It holds knowledge that was almost remembered, ideas that nearly existed, and stories that were begun and left unfinished." Morty wandered slowly, fingers brushing the spines of books that glimmered under his touch. Some were blank, others scribbled in handwriting he almost recognized but couldn't place. Some emitted soft whispers, voices speaking in fragments. And then the stars, but not quite, perhaps, remember. Why are these truths half known? Morty asked softly. Rick shrugged. Because, Morty, not all knowledge is meant to be complete. Some things exist only in possibility. Some truths are like that. Fragile. The universe keeps them here, tucked away, in case someone notices, in case someone needs them. Morty lifted a thin, glowing scroll. It unraveled in the air, revealing words that shimmered and shifted as he read. A story about a Rick who built a bridge between two timelines, a Morty who laughed at a joke that never reached the punchline, and a city that existed only in glimpses. The letters glimmered, then faded, leaving only the faint scent of ink and memory. "It's beautiful," Morty whispered, "but also sad." Rick nodded, eyes tracing a distant aisle. "Exactly. Half-truths teach patience, Morty. They remind you that not everything can be solved. Not everything can be known. And that's okay. Sometimes understanding the edge of a thing is more important than fully grasping it." Morty wandered further, noticing books stacked in gentle spirals like eddies in a river. Some titles made no sense, or changed as he looked at them. One read The Last Song That Was Never Sung, another Conversations Between Stars That Forgot Each Other, and another The Map of Places That Almost Were. He ran his hand over the last one. A soft voice floated from the pages. "Sometimes the paths you never take teach you more than the ones you do." Morty smiled faintly, feeling the warmth of recognition. He realized that these half-known truths weren't failures. They were invitations. Invitations to notice, to wonder, to fill in the gaps with thought and feeling, and to accept the beauty in the unknown. Rick crouched beside him, pointing to a shelf lit faintly from within. "See that one? That's a memory that never fully formed. Someone almost remembered a Rick's kindness in a timeline that didn't happen. But it's here, and now. You notice it. That's the point." Morty touched the book, feeling a small hum in his chest. He understood that by noticing, by being present, he could bring fragments of the half-remembered into gentle life. It didn't matter if he held them forever. The act of attention itself mattered. A soft gust of wind shifted the pages around him, carrying whispers. Even in what you do not know, the heart remembers. Morty felt a calmness settle over him. He realized the library was not just a place of knowledge, but a sanctuary, a place where incompleteness was not a flaw, but a gift, a reminder that even in uncertainty there is wonder, there is learning, there is quiet awe. Rick stood, glancing at the rows that stretched into infinity. "All right, Morty, time to move on. But take this with you. Some truths are half known, some stories unfinished. And that's the part you carry. That's where growth happens. That's where you live. Morty nodded, carefully setting the glowing scroll back on the shelf. He felt lighter, steadier, as if the library had filled him with soft courage to embrace not knowing. They walked together toward the portal, stepping carefully over floating books and softly humming manuscripts. Morty glanced back once. The library stretched on endlessly, a quiet, infinite space of half-truths, waiting patiently for anyone who noticed. He knew he would carry its gentle lesson with him, that not all answers are given, but every attentive heart can find meaning in what remains unseen. And as they stepped through the portal, Morty felt a quiet pulse of understanding echo through him, soft as a whisper. Sometimes the beauty of life exists not in certainty, but in the quiet embrace of what we cannot fully know. The portal opened to a hilltop, under a sky that seemed impossibly vast. Morty blinked at the night above him, not a normal night sky, but a canopy of stars that shimmered faintly, some burning bright, others glowing dimly, and a few flickering as if struggling to remember why they existed. Rick stood beside him, arms crossed, eyes reflecting the scattered constellations. "Welcome to the Observatory of Forgotten Stars," he said softly. "Most people never see this place. Most stars here have no names, no stories attached. They're the light of choices, moments, and memories that were never fully remembered, not by anyone." Morty stepped forward, letting the cool breeze brush his face. He felt a gentle pull toward the dim stars, sensing a quiet sadness, but also something else, patience, resilience, and a quiet longing to be seen. Why do they shine if no one remembers them? Morty asked, voice barely above the wind. Rick smiled faintly. Because, Morty, even forgotten things still exist. Even lost choices, missed chances, and quiet acts of kindness have weight. They're part of the universe. And somewhere, somehow, they matter. Morty noticed a faint trail of stars spiraling, downward, toward a crystal platform in the center of the observatory. He walked closer, feeling the pulse of energy beneath his feet. Each star that drifted by seemed to hum a soft, forgotten song. Fragments of laughter, whispered promises, and gentle sighs from lives that might have been. Rick crouched, plucking a tiny, flickering star from the air. "See this one? It's a memory someone almost had. A word they almost said, a feeling they almost felt. It didn't make it into their story, but it still exists. Quiet, persistent, patient." Morty held his hand under the star. It shimmered, warming his palm like it was grateful to be noticed. He realized the stars were not just light. They were echoes of life itself, reminders that even what fades matters if you acknowledge it. A soft gust blew through the observatory, carrying whispers of unspoken words. "I remember. I forgive. I loved." Morty closed his eyes, letting the words wrap around him. It wasn't sad. It wasn't painful. It was beautiful. Rick stood and gestured to the vast expanse above. "Look at them all, Morty. Every flicker, every dim glow. That's life you didn't see. Choices you didn't make, moments you barely noticed. And yet, they still shine. That's the lesson." Morty tilted his head, tracing the paths of forgotten stars. Some moved in gentle spirals, some lingered alone, others clustered in soft constellations that seemed almost familiar. He felt the pull of infinite stories, not his own, but connected to him in subtle ways, a reminder that even what we miss contributes to the quiet flow of the universe. "Do they ever fade completely?" Morty asked softly. Rick shook his head. "No, Morty, not truly. They just wait for someone to notice. Sometimes that's you, sometimes that's someone else. But nothing that mattered ever really disappears." Morty reached out again, brushing his fingers along a flickering constellation. A warmth spread through him, a gentle reassurance. Even when life felt chaotic, even when choices seemed lost or forgotten, there was still beauty, there was still light. And sometimes, noticing, it was enough. They stayed in silence for a while, the only sounds the soft wind and the hum of countless stars. Morty felt his chest rise and fall with the rhythm of the forgotten light, as if the cosmos itself had a heartbeat he could sense. Rick finally clapped him on the shoulder. "All right, Morty. Time to leave before these stars get too lonely. But take this lesson. Never underestimate the quiet light of what's forgotten. It's always there, waiting, patient, gentle, just like the best parts of you." Morty nodded, looking up one last time at the observatory. The stars shimmered, faint and persistent, a soft chorus of the lives that had almost been remembered. He understood then that forgetting wasn't loss, it was potential, and somewhere deep in his chest he carried that quiet, infinite glow with him as they stepped back through the portal. And somewhere above them, the forgotten stars continued to shimmer. They whispered, they hummed, they waited. And if you listened, even for a moment, you could feel the soft pulse of every life, every choice, every quiet moment that had ever been. The portal opened into a garden unlike any Morty had seen. The ground was soft beneath his feet, dotted with flowers that glowed faintly in hues he couldn't name. Shadows stretched across the paths, but they were not dark or threatening. They moved gently, curling and folding around the plants, the trees, and the small hidden streams that whispered as they flowed. Rick walked beside him, hands clasped behind his back. "Welcome, Morty. This is the Garden of Soft Shadows. It's a place where the parts of yourself you've hidden, forgotten, or feared, they take form. But here, nothing is dangerous. Shadows are gentle, software waiting to be understood." Morty hesitated, glancing at his own shadow stretching long and thin across the path. It twitched and shifted, and for a moment it seemed to reach for him. A small chill ran through him, but it was more curiosity than fear. Rick crouched, picking up a glowing petal from the ground. "See this, Morty? That's a tiny part of a fear you carried once. Look at it, acknowledge it, and watch what happens." Morty reached down, letting the petal float into his palm. It shimmered softly, almost like a heartbeat, and he realized it wasn't threatening. It was patient, waiting for him to notice. He wandered deeper into the garden, noticing shadows curling around flowers, moving like they were listening, observing. Some shadows resembled memories he had tried to forget, moments of doubt, embarrassment, fleeting panic. Others held hope, courage, small acts of kindness he had long overlooked. Rick followed, voice calm. "You see, Morty, most people run from their shadows. They think shadows are threats, but here, shadows are teachers. They show you what you've hidden, and if you look closely, you learn more than you ever could from light alone." Morty knelt beside a stream that reflected a patchwork of light and shadow. He saw himself, younger Morty, hesitant, worried, trembling. Then older Morty, patient, thoughtful, smiling quietly. And the shadows shifted, intertwining with these images, forming a tapestry of everything he had feared and everything he had quietly become. "It's beautiful," Morty whispered. "Even the scary parts?" Rick smiled. "Especially the scary parts. That's where growth hides. That's where courage waits. You don't ignore the shadows, Morty. You notice them. You learn from them. You carry the lessons softly with you." Morty followed a narrow path lined with tall, whispering plants. The shadows stretched along the stems, curling around blossoms like ribbons of smoke. A soft hum filled the air, a melody that was part memory, part possibility. He realized the garden itself was alive with attention, and every shadow responded to the care he gave by observing, by acknowledging, by simply being present. A small cluster of shadows floated toward him, taking the shape of moments he regretted, words he had said too sharply, actions he had rushed, kindnesses left unspoken. But instead of fear, he felt calm. The shadows weren't there to punish him. They were there to show him what he carried and how he could move forward softly, gently, consciously. Rick placed a hand on his shoulder. "Morty, shadows aren't enemies, they're reminders. That's the beauty of this place. Even the parts of yourself you've overlooked. They matter. And if you notice them, if you tend to them, you grow." Morty breathed in slowly, letting the hum of the garden fill him. He walked among the glowing flowers, feeling the shadows weave around him, embracing him gently, showing him the hidden corners of his heart. When he finally stood at the edge of the garden, He felt lighter. He realized that even fears could be soft, even regrets could glow gently when seen with patience, and that courage wasn't loud or bold. It was quiet, patient, present in the small, tender acceptance of everything he was, everything he had been, and everything he might yet become. Rick nodded, glancing at the portal. Time to move on, Morty, but remember this. The shadows are part of you. They travel with you, quietly, patiently, and when you notice them, they turn into light. Morty stepped toward the portal, feeling the garden's hum linger in his chest. The shadows waved softly in farewell, curling around the glowing blossoms like gentle promises, and somewhere in the soft folds of the garden of shadows, Morty realized courage, understanding, and quiet acceptance are not found in grand gestures, but in the gentle noticing of what is already with you. The portal opened to a small workshop tucked into a quiet valley. The room smelled faintly of oil and old wood. Clocks of every shape and size lined the walls, their hands moving in gentle, uneven rhythms. Some ticked fast, some slow, some seemed to pause entirely, yet none of the sounds clashed. They formed a quiet symphony, soft and meditative. Morty stepped inside, feeling the subtle pulse of time around him. Rick followed, hands in his pockets, eyes scanning the intricate mechanisms. This, Rick said quietly, is the clockmaker's forgotten hour. Most people never notice it. It's the space between ticks, the gentle stretch of time no one measures, the moments that slip quietly by, unnoticed. Morty leaned closer to a small clock, its hands barely moving. He felt the pulse in the air, a slow rhythm that seemed to echo the beating of his own heart. It feels calm, he whispered, like time itself is breathing. Rick nodded. Exactly, Morty. Everyone obsesses about seconds and hours rushing to fill them, but the forgotten hour, that's where life whispers. That's where reflection, understanding, and patience live. Most people skip it, but if you notice, it changes everything. Morty walked slowly, letting his hands hover over the clocks. Each one radiated faint warmth, as if the moments they measured were aware, alive, waiting to be felt. Some ticks reminded him of mornings spent quietly with Summer, others of late nights with Rick, where words were few but understanding ran deep. A small pocket watch floated toward him, glowing softly. Morty opened it, and inside he saw fragments of moments he hadn't cherished. Tiny choices, fleeting glances, words said too fast, smiles barely returned. And yet, in this light, he didn't feel regret. He felt a gentle understanding, as if the clockmaker had compressed time itself to show him the quiet value in everything he had experienced. Rick crouched beside him, whispering, "The forgotten hour isn't about what you missed, Morty. It's about noticing what's there. The tiny beats of life, the soft seconds that hold more than you ever realize. They're patient, waiting for you to see them." Morty breathed deeply, feeling the rhythm in his chest align with the subtle ticking around him. He understood that time was not just measured in hours or days, it was measured in noticing, in presence, in quiet awareness. A gentle chime echoed from the far end of the workshop. Morty turned to see a clock with no hands, its face smooth and dark. Rick gestured toward it. "That one's special. It doesn't count minutes or hours, it counts attention. The more you notice, the more it moves. The less you notice, it waits. That's the secret of the forgotten hour, Morty." Morty smiled faintly. He reached out, placing a hand over the smooth face. The air hummed softly, a rhythm he could feel in his chest, in his lungs, in his heartbeat. It wasn't about rushing. It wasn't about control. It was about listening, being present, understanding that every tick and pause mattered in its own quiet way. Rick stood, patting Morty's shoulder. "All right, Morty, time to go. But carry this rhythm with you. Let it guide you. Let it remind you that even in chaos, there are quiet moments that matter more than any big event." Morty nodded, stepping toward the portal. He glanced once at the clocks, all moving in their own uneven rhythms. He realized the forgotten hour wasn't really lost. It was always there, waiting for anyone willing to notice. As the portal shimmered open, Morty took a slow, deep breath. The pulse of the clocks, the gentle stretch of time followed him softly, like a heartbeat he could carry into every world, every choice, every quiet moment that mattered. And somewhere in the clockmaker's workshop, the forgotten hour ticked on, software patient, eternal, and if you listened carefully, you could hear it whisper, "Notice, notice, notice." The portal opened to a narrow bridge suspended over a river of light. Morty stepped cautiously onto the planks, which seemed to hum faintly under his feet. The river beneath him glowed softly, filled with drifting whispers, fragments of words, half-remembered promises, laughter that had faded too quickly. Each ripple carried a subtle glow, flickering as if waiting to be heard. Rick followed silently, hands tucked behind his back. "This," he said softly, "is the bridge between whispers. It's a place where unspoken words travel, where thoughts and feelings that were never shared float gently, waiting to be noticed." Morty looked down, seeing whispers rise like tiny lights, swirling in the current below. Some glimmered warmly, like comforting memories. Others flickered nervously, shy or hesitant, as though afraid to be seen. Why do they stay here?" Morty asked. Rick's gaze followed the river. "Because, Morty, even words you never say matter. Even thoughts left behind, feelings unspoken. They shape who you are. They ripple outward, affecting everything, everyone. And some of them, they wait for someone willing to notice, to acknowledge them gently." Morty took a slow step forward, letting the bridge hum beneath him. He reached toward a drifting whisper that glowed faintly blue. It floated into his hand like a feather, carrying the soft echo of a thank you he hadn't said to someone long ago. He smiled, feeling warmth in his chest as the whisper pulsed softly. Rick crouched beside him, voice low. "You see, Morty, not all communication is loud. Some of the most important words are the ones never spoken. You don't need to fix everything. You just notice. That's enough." Morty moved slowly along the bridge, letting the whispers swirl around him. Some reflected past regrets, times he had been impatient, unkind, or too scared to act. Others glimmered with tiny joys, brief moments of care or laughter shared without thought. The bridge felt alive, carrying the quiet weight of everything left unsaid. A soft breeze lifted a cluster of whispers toward him, forming shapes he almost recognized. His mother's gentle scolding, Summer's laughter, Rick's rare, quiet smile. Morty let them drift through his fingers, feeling their presence without judgment. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't longing. It was understanding. The gentle recognition that even unspoken things mattered. Rick stepped forward, gesturing at the river below. "Look at that, Morty. That's the beauty of the bridge. Every whisper, every word that never left your lips. It's still alive. And if you pay attention, it can guide you, teach you, even heal you." Morty paused, closing his eyes. He let the current hum through him, the whispers brushing against his skin like soft fingers. He realized that communication wasn't just about speaking or being heard. It was about noticing, listening, and allowing the quiet presence of understanding to flow between hearts. A bright whisper floated toward him, wrapping around his wrist like a ribbon. He heard a gentle voice. "I see you. I understand." And Morty felt a lump in his throat, not from sadness, but from the quiet awe of being truly noticed. Rick stood beside him, patting his shoulder gently. "All right, Morty, the bridge has lessons. Notice, listen, carry the whispers with you. They're stronger than you think, even if you never say a word aloud." Morty nodded. Stepping toward the end of the bridge, he looked down one last time at the glowing river of whispers. He realized the bridge wasn't about reaching the other side. It was about moving carefully, softly, and being present with every word, every thought, every echo of connection. As the portal shimmered open, Morty took a slow breath. He carried the bridge with him, the soft hum of unspoken words, the gentle glow of whispers acknowledged, the quiet pulse of understanding. And somewhere below, the river of light continued to flow. It shimmered, it whispered, it waited patiently. And if you paused, even for a moment, you could hear the gentle lesson. Every quiet word matters. Every soft thought counts, and listening is the greatest gift of all. The portal opened onto a vast, rolling meadow bathed in twilight. Morty blinked, feeling the softness of grass beneath his feet and hearing the faint rustle of petals in the gentle wind. The air carried a sound he couldn't place at first, soft, lilting, as if the world itself were humming quietly. As he listened, he realized they were lullabies, melodies half-remembered from dreams he hadn't had yet, sung by voices he had never met. Rick walked beside him, moving slowly among the flowers. "Welcome, Morty. This is the Meadow of Forgotten Lullabies. Every song here was once sung somewhere in the universe, but then it faded. Not gone, just waiting for someone to hear it again." Morty knelt in the grass, letting a gentle breeze lift the strands of his hair. The lullabies wrapped around him like soft threads, each carrying warmth and quiet comfort. He felt a strange familiarity. These songs weren't his, yet they were, somehow, part of him. "Why do they feel safe?" Morty asked softly. Rick smiled faintly. "Because they're meant to be, Morty. They hold the quiet memories of comfort, care, and patience. Every lullaby carries reassurance, even if it was forgotten, even if the singer is gone. That's the point. The world remembers in subtle ways, in soft songs that float endlessly until someone listens." Morty wandered through the meadow, letting the melodies guide him. Some were faint whispers nearly lost in the wind. Others swelled and shimmered, as though the meadow itself were joining in the chorus. Each song carried a fragment of a story, a memory, a hope, or a gentle lesson left behind by someone. Somewhere, long ago, a small cluster of glowing flowers swayed toward him, each petal vibrating with soft sound. Morty reached out, letting the songs drift into his hands. He felt warmth in his chest, a quiet comfort that seemed to fill every corner of him. It wasn't music meant to entertain. It was music meant to heal, to remind, to nurture. Rick crouched beside him, voice low. "See, Morty, not all gifts are seen. Some are felt, some are carried in soft notes, in echoes of care that linger long after the singer has gone. That's what makes them special." Morty closed his eyes, letting the melodies wash over him. He heard fragments of lullabies. "Rest easy, little one. The world is wide, but you are safe. Remember the quiet moments and hold them close." He realized the meadow wasn't just about forgotten songs. It was about attention, about noticing, about carrying a quiet awareness of beauty and care, even when no one else does. A soft breeze lifted one particularly bright melody, wrapping it gently around his shoulders. He felt a warmth and safety that reminded him of nights when Summer's laughter or Rick's rare kindness had felt like a gentle cloak. He understood that these songs weren't just comfort for him. They were the shared memory of care across time, space, and countless worlds, a network of quiet love that continued, patiently, endlessly. Rick stood looking across the glowing meadow. "Time to move on, Morty, but take the lullabies with you. Let them remind you, even when everything feels chaotic, even when the world seems too big, there is always a quiet space. There is always a melody waiting for you." Morty nodded, feeling the soft pulse of the meadow in his chest. As he stepped toward the portal, the songs followed gently, humming around him, fading slowly but never truly gone. He knew that somewhere in the vastness of infinite worlds, these lullabies continued to drift, soft and patient, waiting for anyone willing to listen. And somewhere, in the meadow under endless twilight, the forgotten lullabies sang on, soft, gentle, eternal. And if you listened, even for a moment, you could feel their quiet warmth, wrapping the heart in calm and wonder. The portal opened to a quiet hall, lined with mirrors that stretched from floor to ceiling. Morty stepped inside, feeling the air hum with a soft, expectant energy. Each mirror reflected him, but not quite as he was. Some showed him older, wiser, smiling softly, others younger, hesitant, unsure. Some revealed moments he had yet to live, paths that shimmered faintly, untaken but waiting. Rick followed behind, quiet as ever. "This is the mirror of unseen tomorrows," he said softly. "Most people never look here. They fear the future or cling too tightly to the past. But this mirror, it shows what might be, what could be, and what's quietly waiting for attention. Not to scare you, Morty, but to teach you to notice." Morty approached a mirror that reflected him walking across a sunlit meadow he didn't recognize. He smiled faintly at the sight, feeling a warmth in his chest. Then he stepped back and saw another version, alone in a dark room reading a book, quiet and contemplative. Neither reflection seemed right or wrong. Both existed, softly, in parallel possibility. Why show me these?" Morty whispered. Rick's gaze was steady. "Because, Morty, the future isn't a single line. It's a collection of whispers, shadows, and small choices. Not all of them will happen, but they're still real in a way, and noticing them, gently, patiently, helps you understand what matters to you." Morty moved slowly, letting his eyes drift over the reflections. Some mirrors showed him laughing with friends he hadn't met yet, sharing stories, small joys. Others showed moments of quiet solitude, meditation, and soft understanding of his own heart. Each reflection carried a subtle message. Life isn't just about certainty. It's about noticing, choosing, and gently walking forward. Rick crouched beside him, pointing to a mirror with a faint flickering glow. "That one's special, Morty. It's a version of you that might never exist unless you pay attention, but just seeing it teaches patience, hope, and care. You don't force it, you just notice. That's enough." Morty reached out, letting his fingers brush the glass. He felt a gentle warmth, a quiet pulse, as though the reflection itself breathed softly, waiting, patient. It wasn't about control. It wasn't about knowing exactly what would come. It was about understanding possibility, holding hope lightly, and walking forward with attention. A soft breeze rippled through the hall, carrying faint whispers. "You will notice. You will care. You will grow." Morty closed his eyes, letting the words settle like a gentle cloak. He realized that the mirror of unseen tomorrows wasn't about predicting or fearing the future. It was about presence, gentle awareness, and carrying quiet hope in the small choices made each day. Rick stood, giving him a light pat on the shoulder. "All right, Morty, time to move on. Remember this, the future isn't a threat and it isn't a prize. It's a collection of soft possibilities, and the more you notice them, the more you shape your path with care." Morty nodded, taking a slow, deliberate step toward the portal. He glanced once more at the hall of mirrors. The reflections shimmered, flickered, and hummed softly, patient and gentle. He understood then that even unseen tomorrows could carry warmth, meaning, and quiet guidance, if only he chose to notice. As the portal shimmered open, Morty felt the subtle pulse of possibility follow him. He knew that somewhere countless versions of himself were walking softly, learning gently, and carrying hope without expectation. And somewhere in the hall of mirrors the unseen tomorrows waited quietly, patiently, endlessly, a gentle reminder that life is always soft, always unfolding, always full of quiet wonder. The portal opened to a quiet river that wound endlessly through a valley of soft mist. Morty stepped to the edge, feeling the cool, smooth water lap gently against his shoes. The river glowed faintly in shades of silver and blue, carrying with it ripples of soft light. As he looked closer, he noticed small shapes drifting along, fragments of lives, quiet moments, and journeys no one had spoken of. Rick stood behind him, hands clasped calmly. "This," he said, voice soft, "is the river of unspoken journeys. Every ripple, every current is a story that never got told, a choice someone didn't make, a thought left behind, a step someone forgot to take, and yet they flow together, endlessly, waiting for someone to notice." Morty leaned over the river, watching tiny reflections shimmer in the water. He saw flashes of Mortys from countless worlds, each walking quietly through their own lives. Some seemed joyful, others hesitant, some tired, some curious, and all of them drifted gently together, connected by the river, even if they never met. Why do they float here? Morty asked. Rick's gaze followed a slow current of glowing light. Because, Morty, not all journeys are spoken, not all choices are witnessed, but that doesn't mean they don't matter. Even unspoken things leave a mark, carry weight, and move the world in quiet ways. The river collects them. It shows that nothing is ever truly lost. Morty extended his hand, letting a ripple wash across his palm. He felt the hum of lives he would never live, decisions he would never make. And yet, there was a calm, a quiet beauty in seeing them flow together. He realized that even unspoken journeys had meaning, and noticing them was enough to honor their presence. Rick crouched beside him, pointing to a small swirl of silver light. See that, Morty? That's a memory someone almost had, a word they almost said, a kindness left unsaid. It's tiny, but it matters, and when you notice it, you acknowledge it, you carry it softly with you. Morty watched the river drift on, seeing more moments shimmer in the mist. A Rick teaching a lesson gently, a Morty laughing quietly, a glance shared and never spoken aloud. He understood then that the river wasn't just a collection of lost journeys. It was a living record of attention, care, and the subtle threads that connect everything across infinite worlds. A soft breeze lifted a glowing ripple toward him, brushing against his cheek like a whispered promise. Even the quietest moments leave light. Morty felt warmth fill his chest, gentle and steady. It wasn't about guilt or regret. It was about understanding the beauty in what had already passed, and the grace in noticing it. Rick stood, placing a hand on Morty's shoulder. Time to go, Morty. But remember this. Life flows like this river, sometimes fast, sometimes slow, sometimes unseen. You can't control every current, but you can notice it. You can float along with it, and that's enough. Morty nodded, taking a slow, steady step toward the portal. He looked back once, watching the silver-blue water shimmer with endless, quiet journeys. The river continued to flow, patient, gentle, eternal. And if you paused, even for a moment, you could feel the soft pulse of unspoken lives, drifting quietly, waiting to be acknowledged, carrying the calm of everything that had ever been and everything yet to come. The portal opened to a meadow bathed in the gentle glow of starlight. Morty stepped forward, feeling the soft grass bend beneath his feet. Above him, stars shimmered like tiny lanterns, each one casting a quiet reflection across the field. The air carried a faint hum, a mixture of distant lullabies, whispered journeys, and the soft pulse of the worlds he had visited. Rick stood beside him, silent for a moment, letting the calm settle. "This is it, Morty," he said softly, "the starlit meadow of soft goodbyes. Every journey you've seen, every shadow, every lullaby, every river, it all comes here in the end. Not as an ending exactly, but as a place to breathe, reflect, and let the quiet moments speak." Morty looked around. He saw echoes of the observatory of forgotten stars, the garden of soft shadows, the clockmaker's forgotten hour, the bridge between whispers, and the river of unspoken journeys. All the lessons, the gentle wisdom, the small moments of noticing and understanding, they were here, woven into the soft shimmer of starlight. He took a deep breath, letting the meadow fill him. The gentle wind carried whispers. You noticed, you cared, you grew. He closed his eyes, letting the quiet of the meadow sink into him. There was no hurry, no expectation, only presence, only peace. Rick knelt, picking up a small glowing stone from the grass. "This is a token, Morty. It carries all the soft lessons you've gathered. Keep it in your chest, wherever you go, and remember, nothing you've seen or felt is ever lost. Even when worlds fade, even when time moves on, the quiet moments remain." Morty nodded, feeling the warmth of the stone seep into his heart. He thought of the stars that shimmered in the observatory, the shadows that taught him patience, the clocks that whispered of gentle rhythms, the whispers and lullabies that carried care, and the unseen tomorrows waiting patiently. All of it was soft, quiet, and alive. Rick stood, patting Morty's shoulder gently. "All right, Morty, time to rest now. Take everything you've seen, let it settle. Carry it softly like a melody you hum to yourself. You've done well, Morty. You've noticed. You've cared. That's more than most ever do." Morty took a slow step forward, feeling the meadow embrace him. He felt the gentle presence of all the worlds, all the lessons, all the quiet wonder he had witnessed. It was a soft exhale, a closing of a gentle chapter, not an ending, but a pause, a rest. The stars above shimmered like tiny eyes watching, patient and kind. He looked up one last time, letting the light of 1,000 soft goodbyes fill him, and he understood that the journey was never about rushing or conquering or knowing everything. It was about noticing, being present, and carrying quiet light wherever you went. Morty stretched slowly, letting the meadow hum around him. He smiled faintly, feeling calm and full. And somewhere, in the distance, a soft whisper echoed, "Thank you for noticing. Thank you for caring." And with that, he lay back in the grass, letting the stars blanket him. Everything was soft, everything was calm, and somewhere he was still drifting gently through the infinite worlds, carrying the quiet wisdom of everything he had seen.